The body of assassinated President John F. Kennedy will lie in repose at the White House tomorrow to be viewed by mourning members of his family and high dignitaries of the government. The general public will not be admitted tomorrow. The White House announced tonight that the body, flown from Dallas for the same Air Force jet bringing the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, to the nation's capital, will be on view from 10 a.m. until 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time Saturday. The presidential plane also carrying Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Johnson of course, came into Andrews Air Force Base at 6:15 p.m. this evening. President Johnson, Speaker of the House John McCormick, next in succession, as we have said, to the presidency, and former residents and members of the executive branch holding presidential appointments will be in at 11, and other dignitaries will follow during the day. And this story from London, a group of 61 New York-bound airline passengers, almost all of them Americans, were about to board their plane in London tonight when somebody cried, "The president is dead." The passengers reacted with shocked disbelief to the news of President Kennedy's death. As they said, most of them were unable to believe this tragedy has happened, and this has been, of course, the general reaction the world over. In Washington, the stark gray Navy ambulance driving through the dark November streets bore the body of the slain president back to Washington for the last time tonight. Closeted in grief behind drawn curtains rode John F. Kennedy's widow, along with a group of his closest friends and associates. The route traveled from Andrews Air Force Base in nearby Maryland to Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the body will be held overnight. Speaker John W. McCormick announced that the dead president be taken to the White House tomorrow, and then, as we said, will lie in state in the Capitol for the public mourning all day Sunday. The official mourning, of course, will be tomorrow. On the arrival at Andrews, the bronze-colored casket of the assassinated chief executive was placed on the lift truck at a plane door by 4 of President Kennedy's aides, and flashes of bronze light glittered with a painful intensity from floodlights at the mournful scene. Now for a report on one of the officers who arrested the suspect, who was in on the arrest of the suspect. We switch to Bob Whitten at KCRA in Sacramento, California.
What the first call that I got was that the president had been shot. The shot had come from the Texas School Book Depository at Elm and Houston Street. They sent me down there. I started in with a couple of deputy sheriffs. We were shaking the building as well as a bunch of other officers, but one of these deputies and I were lucky enough to find the window where the shots were fired from, and also the 3 shells laying on the floor. I went back down, secured the scene, went back down to report to the inspector so he could get the crime lab and everything out there. And while I was there talking to him, a call came out that an officer had been shot. Some citizen was using the police radio. That call came out. The acting lieutenant in Oak Cliff and I were together, standing there talking to the inspector, and he ordered us, being that we had all the police in town pulled down there on Elm Street, he ordered us to leave this investigation of the president shooting and go to Oak Cliff. We did. Got out there, the officer had already been picked up. We got a description of the suspect, started following his path as best we could. Had information that he was in one of 2 houses that were vacant over on East Jefk'S. We went in over there and called for some more help to cover up the buildings and everything. Shut those down. He wasn't there, and then we got a report that he was in the library at Marsalis and in Jefferson.
Where were these reports coming from, Jim?
From people who had heard the description of the man. Then when we got to the library and found out that was another false alarm, the 3rd call came in that he had been seen entering the Texas Theater. Bob Barnett from the FBI and I went into the theater, and everybody else put it off outside. We started checking out the patrons in the theater. The movie was still going on. And on the 3rd one that McDonald started to approach, who was sitting in the 3rd row from the back in the center section, just as McDonald got to him, he jumped up and yelled, "This is it." And he struck McDonald in the face and grabbed for a pistol, which he had under his shirt. When he did that, Mac yelled, and all 7 of us got into a fight, and finally got him subdued and handcuffed, or disarmed and then handcuffed. And we were then instructed by a captain to get him out there and get him to Central Station as fast as we could. Incidentally, Paul Bentley was in on it with us. When we got him outside, I don't know whether the people in the neighborhood had just heard about the policeman's death or whether they had heard about, I'm sure they'd heard about the president's too. But there were some 600 to 800 people outside yelling, kill him, and this, that, and the other, and some more officers had to be pressed into service right quick that didn't actually have their hands on him to force the crowd back so we could get him in the car without anybody touching him. We brought him down and turned him and the pistol and everything over to Captain Fritz. The boy that we apprehended for shooting Officer J.D. Tippett is an employee of the book factory where the shots that killed the president were fired from. He was seen on the floor below the window where the shots were fired some 15 minutes prior to the shooting. He was a former U.S. Marine marksman who defected to Russia in 1957 and returned to the United States approximately a year ago with a Russian bride, I understand. He did admit in the interrogation a while ago he was an active communist. He has not admitted the shooting of the president or the governor or the police officer, but a gun was found on the 6th floor where it had been hidden that I have been told, and I can't verify this either way, was made in Argentina. The man, I understand, has resorted to violence before and possibly shot another policeman somewhere. He won't admit anything other than he was a communist. He started screaming brutality as soon as we got the handcuffs on him. And when he got down here and was talking to Fritz and them, the only thing he said is, when I told you I was a communist, I admitted everything. I'm going to tell you your words to that effect. And I want a lawyer. I demand my rights. But circumstances being as they are with all the other situations together, I firmly believe that we got the man that killed the President of the United States.
Jerry, did you talk to him any?
Bob, he's very arrogant. We offered him an opportunity on the way to the station. We told him there were going to be a large number of photographers there, and we quite naturally, automatically, everybody thinks brutality when if you catch a cop killer, you know. We told him that that there would be photographers there, and if he wanted to hide his head, we would hold him loose enough. We were going to hold him, but he could bend over and hide his face against his chest, or just bend over where they couldn't get a clear view of him or anything like that. This he refused to do. While he would not admit anything, he seemed very arrogant and proud of what was happening to him.
Didn't show any sign of nervousness at all?
Didn't show any sign of nervousness at all. Continually made threats against the officers all the way downtown, and I rode in the car with him about the brutality and his rights, and made the statement when we started questioning about killing the officer. He made a statement. He said, I don't have to tell y'all anything.
What kind of a weapon did he use to kill the officer with, Jerry?
38 snub nose. It was fired twice, and both shots hit the officer in the forehead.
What are they going to do with him now?
Captain Fritz, Secret Service, and the Rangers and the FBI have all questioned him. And the halls out here are working live with people, quite naturally. And they moved him upstairs for a little while. And I'm sure that later they'll bring him back down and interrogate him some more. But they wanted to go out to his house and check and find his car and all that stuff and see, if they could find any more things that would tie him in. Understand that this is being done quite rapidly and that some of the pieces are falling into place pretty good.
You've heard the report of Jerry Hill, Officer Jerry Hill of the Dallas Police Department, who arrested Lee Oswald as a suspect in the shooting of the President of the United States, and you can read between the lines sufficiently to know it has meaning. And now we take you immediately to Robert Goralski at the White House in Washington.
Senator George Smathers of Florida, a very close friend of the late president, Mr. Kennedy, has just come out of the White House and told newsmen about the meeting that President Johnson is having with congressional leaders of both parties. He indicated that there was complete support for the president, that in this time of very grave crisis and grave concern, that members of both parties would rally behind the president. Other members of the congressional leadership are still meeting with President Johnson, including the Majority Leader of the Senate, Mike Mansfield, the Minority Leader, Everett Dirksen, the House Speaker, John McCormick, and the Republican Leader in the House of Representatives, Charles Halleck. At one point, just a short time ago, there were about 2,500 people outside the White House. They've been moved back across Pennsylvania Avenue. Still large numbers are merely standing there looking at the quiet, dark White House at this hour. The only activity here is on the west end where the pressmen are located, where there's a great deal of hubbub and talk between newsmen and photographers. But in the executive mansion itself, all is quiet. The sergeant in charge of the White House front gate has indicated that there were probably about 6 to 8 persons who delivered bouquets for Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy during the hours that have just ended. They were private citizens who came up to the sergeant at the main gate and asked that the bouquets be given to the First Lady. We're now having another news conference out here in front of the White House. We will switch over to it in just a second. I'm sorry, we thought that it was immediately outside the press room. Assistant Press Secretary Andrew Hatcher is holding a briefing right now for newsmen, perhaps giving more details on funeral arrangements, which, as we understand it right now, President Kennedy will be buried Monday in Brookline, Massachusetts. However, we will probably have further details and more information on this period of mourning after Andrew Hatcher, Assistant Press Secretary, concludes his news briefing. And that's the picture here at the moment. Robert Kuralski, NBC News at the White House.
And we have further word from Dallas, Texas, that Lee H. Oswald, the pro-Castro Marxist, admits now, finally, that the pistol used to shoot the policeman in the movie theater where he was captured was his. That is almost tantamount to an admission that he did shoot the policeman attempted. His arrest was attempted. He was, of course, arrested and taken to the police headquarters. And then he denied any part still in the assassination of the President of the United States. But there are indications from Dallas, very definite indications, that this man is going to be charged with a crime in a very short time, if he's not already charged. Let's go to Tom Perryman, station WFAA, again in Dallas.
From here, Morgan, Officer Will Fritz, Captain Will Fritz of the Dallas Police Department, reports that Lee Oswald will be charged with the killing of Officer J.D. Tippit this afternoon. The shooting occurred a few miles from the point President Kennedy was shot to death. The Oswald, the accused, was arrested near the at the theater in Oak Cliff, near where Officer J.D. Tippit was shot to death. And he will be charged with the death of Tippit. Fingerprints from the rifle that was taken from the warehouse are being studied at this time. Also, our reporters at the home of Oswald reports they found a great deal of communist literature in his room. That's the story from here, Morgan.
Well, can you fill us in a little bit, Tom, on one point that we haven't cleared up at all? Now, there were these two officers, Jerry Hill and McDonald, at the theater. That was the making of the arrest, and McDonald was hurt in the scuffling. And now about Tippit. We are not clear as to exactly where Tippit was shot. Now, this man admits that he owned the gun that shot Officer Tippit to death. Where was Tippit shot, and wasn't it before the two officers, sometime before the two officers, say like a matter of minutes or something, captured him in the theater?
As far as we can tell, he was shot shortly before going into the theater. Tippit had stopped Oswald because Oswald appeared to be a suspect in the assassination of President Kennedy. And Tippit made a routine stop of Oswald. At this point, Oswald is alleged to have shot Tippit to death and to have run into the theater, where fellow officers arrested him after trapping him in the back part of the theater.
A very interesting point. Now, he admits that owning the snub-nosed .38 caliber revolver used to shoot the policeman. He admitted that in the interrogation in the Dallas Police headquarters today. And that means he practically admits the killing of the policeman, and the policeman stopped him because he had some suspicion that this man was connected with the assassination of the president. And yet, in all of the questioning, this man denies any part in the assassination of President Kennedy. I believe he's been quoted by the police, hasn't he, Tom, as saying this, and I believe these are the exact words: "I don't know what this is all about. I didn't do anything." Do you have any further quotes on him in that area?
He has denied any knowledge of the assassination. As far as we can tell, there's been no further word from his change of position there.
The mystery deepens, or maybe it doesn't. I guess slowly we'll find out. Now, the checking of the fingerprints on the rifle. It's quite clear that from the doctor's report that rifle bullets ended the life of the president and also wounded Governor John Connally. By the way, can you tell us about John Connally's condition? Has it improved from previous reports of being critical? I see one of our advisors here indicates that it's not as critical as at first thought. What is your impression of that?
We're sorry. We lost some contact with you. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, some of the earlier reports indicated that the condition of Governor John Connally was critical, although the vital functions were going along all right. His pulse was good and his color fairly good and so on.
Right.
And yet he was operated on, and there was a collapsed lung, and it was re-inflated. And then we have a report here, a more recent one, that his condition is not as bad as at first thought. What is your impression of that?
Governor Connally is reported now in satisfactory condition. He'll have to remain in the hospital about 2 weeks, but according to the doctors, he will recover and won't have any trouble. He was first reported as more seriously wounded, and we had some reports that he was shot 3 times. Evidently a bullet ricocheted. He had some broken ribs and some chest injuries, but from late reports from the doctor that worked on Governor Connally, he will recover in about 2 weeks. He's reported now in satisfactory condition.
So now our most important clues, not necessarily the most important activity of the police or the federal authorities, is to find out what fingerprints, if any, are on that rifle, whether the same man that fired the rifle is the man who shot the pistol at the officer. Then we've got a complete round robin of clues, as they used to say in the police business. I happen to be a police reporter, and I assume that that is the pursuit of the federal and state officers at this time. Is that correct?
That's right, Morgan.
Thank you very much. We have further news from Germany about the seriousness of their concern, both as to the death of the president, their feeling about him, because he said he was a Berliner, and he showed them very definitely that the United States was with Germany in the Cold War. And also, they are going to express their feeling officially in a commemoration ceremony. There will be a special meeting of the German Federal Cabinet to be held Sunday, where a commemoration ceremony will be instituted, and that will be in Bonn on Sunday morning. And now this man they've got in custody, I wonder if we could go over his background once again. Incidentally, Lee H. Oswald stands for Lee Harvey Oswald. And as you've heard, he's a former Marine, and he's practically admitted, by admitting ownership of a pistol, to shooting a policeman who tried to grab him. And that was not in the theater, as so many people have suspected, but it was apparently on his way to the theater. The policeman apparently suspected this man, thought he was acting curiously. He had a brown jacket on and apparently disposed of it at some point. It was a tip, incidentally, from a theater cashier that led the police to Lee Harvey Oswald. Mrs. Julie Postal, cashier at the Texas Theater in the Oak Cliff section, a suburban theater in Dallas, said she spotted a man who looked like he was running from someone. He kept changing seats in the theater. That's the first clue to the suspect. She had heard of the shooting of Governor Connally, and of President Kennedy. So there's a very interesting point here about the fact that this man had acted in a suspicious manner. He was excited. Incidentally, the background of the man, Oswald, who was supposed to have married a Russian, some 3 years ago, before he left Russia. He and his wife have 2 children. His Russian wife does not speak English even yet, even though she's been in this country for some time. They have taken her into custody, but for no other purpose than to ask her questions. And now, if you'll recall, we had left at least 6 cabinet officers in the Kennedy cabinet, led by Secretary of State Dean Rusk. They had planned to go from Honolulu, where a strategic meeting had been held concerning South Vietnam and the troubles we're having in Southeast Asia. They were on their way to Honolulu when they received word by radio on the plane that President Kennedy had been shot. They waited for more detail to be sure that the report was correct, and then they discovered that the president was dead, and Secretary of State Dean Rusk then proceeded to advise the rest of the cabinet members with him that the president apparently was dead, and they immediately ordered the plane to return, and it's on its way to Washington. It had stopped the refuel in Honolulu, and it's nonstop now. Honolulu to Washington due about 12:39 a.m. in the morning. Now, the effect of this very intimate detail on the people of Japan has been marked. They had expected the American leaders there, and now they learn the sad death of the President of the United States. So let's go now to John Rich, NBC News in Tokyo.
The Emperor and Empress of Japan have sent a telegram to Mrs. Kennedy expressing deepest sympathy over the death of the President. They speak symbolically for this entire nation, which is shocked almost to disbelief at the assassination. Newspapers are on the streets with extras. The radio and television stations have been broadcasting constantly. It was through television that millions of Japanese first learned of the president's death. Much of this nation was awake and at their TV sets in the middle of the night, awaiting the first live television broadcast by satellite from America. Moments before that program was to begin, an announcer appeared on the screen with the news from Dallas. At the receiving site 100 miles north of Tokyo, where I happened to be one of the 2 Americans present, Japanese technicians and reporters came up to me, put out their hands, and expressed their feelings of sadness and regret. En route back to Tokyo, at each station, Japanese heading off for the weekend holiday could be seen reading the extras, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Americans here, thousands of servicemen and their families, are following the news through direct broadcast from the States over the military Far East network. Expressions of regret and sympathy are pouring in from Japanese political leaders of every leaning. It's likely that Japan will send Prime Minister Ikeda to Washington for President Kennedy's funeral. Mr. Ikeda himself escaped assassination in a knife attack only a few weeks ago. John Rich, NBC News, Tokyo.
And now for further details on Lee Harvey Oswald, the suspect in custody in Dallas, Texas. Today he was formally charged with the murder of a Dallas policeman who was slain shortly after the president died. And Lee Oswald has admitted that he owned the pistol that shot the policeman. The policeman had stopped Lee Oswald on the way to a theater in a suburban area of Dallas, Texas, and the man was arrested there by 2 other policemen and taken to headquarters. We have an interesting report from Austin, Texas, from Mrs. Howard Green, the wife of a state representative. She was a teacher before she married, and she taught Lee Oswald in grammar school in Austin and remembered the assassination, in Fort Worth, that is, and she remembered the assassination suspect as an introvert with below average grade. Incidentally, she discussed with her husband, Representative Green, a Fort Worth Democrat, discussed Oswald when he went to Russia in 1959. At the time, Mrs. Green said, she remembered Oswald as a youth who sought escape in books. He did not apply himself in school. He was a loner who had little to do with classmates. She taught him in the 6th grade at Ridgely Elementary School in Fort Worth. Oswald withdrew from high school only 23 days after starting classes and joined the Marines. That was when he was 17 years old. He later became a marksman with the Marines. And it was while he was in the Marine Corps that he decided he wanted to visit the Soviet Union in 1957. And that's when he went there It's not known why he returned to this country with his Russian wife in 1959. Some said he was disillusioned by Russia. Well, obviously, he was not disillusioned, and the evidence of that is pretty clear in a special interview held with Oswald in New Orleans. And we'll have that interview in a very short time. Now for later developments concerning the new president, Johnson, at the White House. Here is Herbert Kaplow at the White House in Washington.
President Johnson is meeting at this moment in his second-story offices in the Executive Offices building, which is across a small street from the White House proper. This is where he has had his vice presidential headquarters next to the White House building. Mr. Johnson, we are told, is making telephone calls, conferring with some of his aides. He met a little while ago for 45 minutes with legislative leaders, asked them and received from them a pledge of unified support. The president, Lyndon Johnson, made telephone calls also this evening to the three former presidents, Herbert Hoover, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower. We are not told yet. We expect momentarily details on these former presidents' participation in the formalities of the next few days having to do with the funeral and the preliminaries for John F. Kennedy. We are told that President Hoover, former President Herbert Hoover, will be unable to be here tomorrow, but beyond that, we will have to wait for 5 or 10 minutes for the latest details. The Kennedy children, Caroline and John Jr., we are told, as of a few moments ago, had not yet been informed of the death of their father. They left the White House about 3 hours ago, presumably in the company of their nurse, Maud Shaw. Mrs. Kennedy has been with Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the former president, the late president's brother. Their whereabouts at the present time is not given us. They were at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the president's body had been. The scene at the White House has been one of comings and goings of the legislative leaders. Hubert Humphrey, the Senate whip, Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield of Montana, Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen, Speaker of the House John McCormick of former President Kennedy's home state of Massachusetts, Charles Halleck, the House Minority Leader, Senator Smathers, who is Secretary of an important Senate Conference Committee, several other members of the House who met for 45 minutes in one of the early of what probably will be a series of meetings to take place here at the White House in these next days and probably running into weeks as the new president assumes the mantle of office, with it the responsibilities, and in effect has to reorganize and set up his own administration. Mr. Johnson, across the street from the White House, where we are speaking, is the west wing of the White House, about 25 yards from the office of the president. Mr. Johnson's own offices as vice president have been both on Capitol Hill, but as far as his role in the administration as an associate of President Kennedy, his headquarters here on the White House grounds, across from the White House proper, in the big, ornate, somewhat garish and gray executive offices building, which at some time back served as the War Building. The situation now quiet, as several hundred reporters are gathered here on the office wing of the White House waiting for further details. It is likely that there will be more information momentarily on the funeral plans. Herbert Kaplow, NBC News at the White House.
Yes, we now have a report that, as you may remember, President Johnson, when he was vice president, very proudly had his phone listed in the Washington telephone book. He never did like the idea of having an unlisted phone. The idea was that all of his friends could get in touch with him. Now he's finding out something about the loneliness of the man who conducts the executive government of the United States. Tonight, persons calling the number of Vice President Lyndon Johnson suddenly hear a click on the phone an interception, and an operator comes in. And she says, Mr. Johnson can now be reached at the White House. Now for that unfolding story, the background of Lee Oswald. Before that, however,
the NBC radio network will stay on the air with continuous coverage until 1:05 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will resume broadcasting at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Saturday morning with continuous coverage. We pause 10 seconds for station identification.
Wlw-Radio in Cincinnati joins its listeners in an expression of deep sorrow on the death of our president.
We broke off the story of Lee Oswald, the suspect in the presidential assassination, to take a White House report on what's happening now under President Lyndon Johnson. The White House is a very busy, even though a tragic place. Now let's return to the story of Lee Oswald. He has now been arrested by the Dallas police and charged with the murder of a Dallas policeman. He's admitted ownership of a pistol that killed the policeman, the man who intercepted Oswald on his way to a theater. Later, he was arrested in the theater. Now, we've told you about this man's background, an introvert, below average grades in school in Fort Worth, Texas, parents highly respectable, both of them. He joined the Marines at the age of 17, went to Russia, 2 years there, married a Russian woman. She still doesn't speak English. They have 2 children, and he has openly stated that he admires communism, although it is not explained why he returned from Russia, why the Russians apparently refused him citizenship after he had been there 2 years. But he's also an admirer of Fidel Castro of Cuba. And he joined the Cuba Fair Play Committee, one of the committees. As we've told you before, this committee was formed with $5,000 sent to the United Nations to the foreign minister of Cuba by Fidel Castro personally, and the money has been traced. There's no argument about it, and the bank accounts have all been cleared. Now the question comes is, why did this man join the Cuba Fair Play Committee? He has been quoted as saying that he's an admirer of Fidel Castro. Well, it so happens that on August the 21st of this year, he was quite willing to be interviewed at NBC-affiliated radio station WDSU in New Orleans. He was interviewed by 4 reporters on that station, and their purpose was to learn his philosophy, the reason why he admired Castro. And the first question they asked him, and from now on out, it's their interview except for the first question. What is the Cuba Fair Play Committee?
The Fair Play for Cuba Committee, as the name implies, is concerned primarily with Cuban-American relations.
How many people do you have in your committee here in your wife?
I cannot reveal that as secretary of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
Isn't it a secret society?
No, Mr. Butler, it is not. However, it is a standard operating procedure for a political organization consisting of a political minority to safeguard the names and the number of its members.
Well, the Republicans are in the minority. I don't see them hiding their membership.
The Republicans are not the Republicans are a established political party representing a great many people. They represent no radical point of view. They do not have a very violent and sometimes emotional opposition as we do.
No, I see. Well, would you say then that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is not a communist front organization?
The Senate subcommittees who have occupied themselves with investigating the Fair Play for Cuba Committee have found that there is nothing to connect the 2 committees. We have been investigated from several points of view. That is, points of view of taxes, allegiance, aversion, and so forth. The findings have been, as I say, absolutely zero.
Now let me ask you a second question. Who is the secretary of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, the national secretary?
Well, we have a national director who is Mr. V.T. Lee, who has recently returned from Cuba. And because of the fact that the United States government has imposed restrictions on travel to Cuba, he is now under indictment for his traveling to Cuba. This, however, is very convenient for rightist organizations to drag out this or that literature purporting to show a fact which has not been established in law. I said that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee has definitely been investigated. That is very true. I have also said that the total result of that investigation was zero. That is, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is not now on the Attorney General's subversive list. Any other material you may have is superfluous.
Oh, it is? Mr. Oswald, if I may break in a moment, I believe it was mentioned that you at one time asked to renounce your American citizenship and become a citizen of the Soviet Union. Is that correct?
Well, I don't think that has particular import to this discussion. We are discussing the Cuban-American relations.
Well, no, I think it has a bearing to this extent, Mr. Oswald. You say, apparently, that Cuba is not dominated by Russia. And yet, you apparently, by your own past actions, have shown that you have an affinity for Russia and perhaps communism, although I don't know that you admit that you either are a communist or have been. Could you straighten out that point? Are you or have you been a communist?
Well, I had answered that prior to this program on another radio program.
Are you a Marxist?
Yes, I am a Marxist.
What's the difference?
Well, the difference is primarily the difference between a country like Ghana, Vienna, Yugoslavia, China, or Russia. Very, very great differences. Differences which we appreciate by giving aid, let's say, to Yugoslavia in the sum of $100 million or so per year.
What's the difference?
The difference is, as I said, a very great difference. Many parties, many countries are based on Marxism. Many countries, such as Great Britain, display very socialistic aspects and characteristics. I might point to the socialized medicine of Britain.
I'm curious to know just how you supported yourself during the 3 years that you lived in the Soviet Union. Did you have government subsidy?
I will answer that question directly then, since you will not rest until you get your answer. I worked in Russia. I was under the protection of I was not under the protection of the American government, but that is, I was at all times considered an American citizen. I did not lose my American citizenship.
Did you say you wanted to at one point, though, or what happened?
Well, it's a long, drawn-out situation in which permission to live in the Soviet Union granted to a foreign resident is very rarely given. This requires a certain amount of technicality, technical papers, and so forth. At no time, as I say, did I renounce my citizenship or attempt to renounce my citizenship, and at no time was I out of contact or with the American embassy.
Excuse me, may I interrupt just 1 second? Either one of these two statements is wrong. The Washington Evening Star of October 31st, 1959, page 1, reported that Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine of 4936 Collingwood Street, Fort Worth, Texas, had turned in his passport at the American Embassy in Moscow on that same date, and it said that he had applied for Soviet citizenship. And it seems to me that you renounced your American citizenship if you turned in your passport.
Well, the very obvious answer to that is that I'm back in the United States. A person who renounces citizenship becomes legally disqualified for returning to the United States.
Right, and Soviet authorities, this is from the Washington Post and Times-Herald of November 16, 1959, Soviet authorities had refused to grant it, although they had informed him that he could live in Russia as a resident alien. What did you do during the 2 weeks from October 31st to November 16, 1959?
As I've already stated, of course, this is a whole conversation, and we don't have too much time left of getting away from the Cuban-American problem. However, I'm quite willing to discuss myself for the remainder of this program. As I stated, it is very difficult for a resident, for a foreigner, to get permission to reside in the Soviet Union. During those 2 weeks and during the days that you mentioned, I was, of course, with the knowledge of the American Embassy, getting this permission.
As a practical matter, Mr. Oswald, knowing, as I'm sure you do, the sentiment in America against Cuba, we, of course, severed diplomatic relations some time ago. I would say Castro is about as unpopular as anybody in the world in this country. As a practical matter, what do you hope to gain through your work how do you hope to bring about what you call fair play for Cuba, knowing the sentiment?
The principles of the fair play for Cuba consist of restoration of diplomatic trade and tourist relations with Cuba. That is one of our main points. We are for that. I disagree that this situation regarding American-Cuban relations is very unpopular. We are in a minority, surely. We are, however, not particularly interested in what Cuban exiles or rightist members of rightist organizations have to say. We are primarily interested in the attitude of the United States government towards Cuba. And in that way, we are striving to get the United States to adopt measures which would be more friendly towards the Cuban people and the new Cuban regime in that country. We are not at all communist controlled, regardless of the fact that I have the experience of living in Russia, regardless of the fact that we have been investigated, regardless of any of those facts. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee is an independent organization, not affiliated with any other organization. Our aims and our ideals are very clear and in the best keeping with American traditions of democracy.
Do you agree with Fidel Castro when in his last speech of July 26th of this year, he qualified President John Fitzgerald Kennedy of the United States as a ruffian and a thief? Do you agree with Mr. Castro?
I would not agree with that particular wording. However, I and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee does think that the United States government, through certain agencies, namely the State Department and the CIA, has made monumental mistakes in its relations with Cuba. Mistakes which are pushing Cuba into the sphere of activity of, let's say, a very dogmatic communist country as China is.
Mr. Oswald, would you agree that when Castro first took power, would you agree that the United States was very friendly with Castro, that the people of this country had nothing but admiration for him, that they were very glad to see Batista thrown out?
I would say that the activities of the United States government in regards to Batista were a manifestation of not so much support for Fidel Castro, but rather a withdrawal of support from Batista. In other words, we stopped armaments to Batista. What we should have done was to take those armaments and drop them into the Sierra Maestre, where Fidel Castro could have used them. As for public sentiment at that time, I think even at that time, even before the revolution, there were rumblings of official comments and so forth from government officials against Fidel Castro.
Now, there's the interview by 4 reporters of station WDSU in New Orleans with Lee Oswald on August the 21st of this year. It leaves, as you have heard, many questions unanswered, but I should like to point out that today, when Lee Oswald was brought into the Dallas Police Station House headquarters for questioning, he saw a crowd of newsmen waiting there. He raised his handcuffed hands in a clenched fist as to indicate he was still a Marxist. By the interview, you can tell he is a Russian-type Marxist rather than a Red Chinese-type Marxist. The other major question left unanswered by this young man concerns why he didn't become a citizen in Russia. Now, we can throw a little more light on that. When he turned his passport, his American passport, in to the U.S. Consular building in Moscow, and when reporters tried to talk to him about it, they told him about another man who had tried to turn his passport in. Oswald said to the reporters, and these are his words, quoted from that time in 1957, "Maybe this other man didn't have as good reasons as I have to turn my passport in." He wouldn't say what the reasons were, so we have no evidence as of this time as to whether or not this man is on his own, whether perhaps some security arms of the Russian government told him he would be of more value to Fidel Castro's Cuba in the United States as an American citizen, stirring up trouble, or whether his devotion to Marxism or to the Russians. We have no answer to that as yet, but we do know that even today he raised the clenched fist to the reporters to let them know exactly what kind of a character he was. And now we hear from Washington that funeral arrangements for the late President John Kennedy have been completed. We take you to Robert Goralski at the White House in Washington.
Associate Press Secretary Andrew Hatcher has just announced funeral arrangements for President Kennedy. The body of the late president will lie in repose in the East Room of the White House from 10 o'clock tomorrow morning until 6 p.m. and will lie in state in the rotunda of the Capitol on Sunday and Monday. The president's immediate family will be present tomorrow from 10 to 11 o'clock in the morning. President Lyndon Johnson, Speaker of the House of Representatives John W. McCormick, and Chief Justice of the United States Earl Warren are scheduled to arrive from 11 a.m. tomorrow to 2 p.m. tomorrow afternoon. Former President Dwight D. Eisenhower will be present at this time. Former President Herbert Hoover expressed his regrets that he will be unable to attend, and former President Harry S. Truman is planning to arrive in Washington on Sunday. Members of the President's Cabinet, members of the executive branch holding presidential appointments, and close personal friends of the President are also scheduled to arrive from 11 tomorrow morning until 2 tomorrow afternoon. Associate Justices of the Supreme Court will arrive from 2 to 2:30, as will members of the Federal Judiciary. From 2:30 to 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, members of the United States Senate, the House of Representatives, and the governors of the 50 states and territories are scheduled to arrive. Members of the Diplomatic Corps will follow between 5 and 6 tomorrow afternoon. The President's body will be moved from the White House in an official cortege to the rotunda of the Capitol at 1 o'clock Sunday afternoon, where it will lie in state for one day. Members of the President's family, cabinet, and government leaders, and members of the Supreme Court, members of the Congress, and diplomatic representatives of foreign nations will be present at the ceremonies placing the President's body in state mourning. The public will be permitted to file past the bier in the rotunda shortly after its arrival on Sunday and until 9 o'clock Sunday night, and from 9 until 10 o'clock Monday morning. The body will then be moved at 11 o'clock Monday morning to St. Matthew's Cathedral here in Washington for a pontifical requiem mass at 12 noon. The mass will be celebrated by His Eminence Richard Cardinal Cushing, Archbishop of Boston. Seating arrangements for the mass will be assigned by the White House. There is still no indication of where the president will be buried, but it's assumed that he will be buried in the newly acquired presidential plot in Brookline, Massachusetts. Burial is expected to be Monday afternoon. This is Robert Gorelski, NBC News, reporting from the White House.
And now, if we may get ahead of the sad funeral preparations, which are now completed with military precision. The military are in charge of such matters in Washington by a recently passed congressional law. If we may get ahead of that a little and go to the Naval Hospital where the body of the president is under examination. We take you now to Don Herbert at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Washington.
This is Don Herman at the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. I'm down in the basement of the hospital now, just outside the morgue, wherein the remains of the late President John Fitzgerald Kennedy are being examined. The length of time the autopsy will take is not yet known. The President's personal physician, Admiral Berkeley, and other physicians here at the hospital are in attendance. The extent of the autopsy's time, as we say, is not yet known. However, arrangements have been made by the Army for Navy vehicles, 3 Navy vehicles, to transport the remains of the late president to Gawler's funeral home here in the district in Washington. And at the same time, an honor guard of 4 Marines will be accompanying the remains following the autopsy. Elsewhere in the hospital, at the front entrance, still hundreds and hundreds, perhaps several thousand people, it's hard to estimate at this point, are gathered in front of the main entrance awaiting Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Sergeant Shriver's exit from the hospital. They entered the hospital shortly after 7 o'clock and have been there a little over an hour and 15 minutes. They're awaiting, the crowd is awaiting these 3 leaving the hospital. They'll be entering a line of limousines that are patiently lined up in front of the hospital, all dutifully performing their tasks. The drivers of the car, the Marines, the doctors, all the hospital personnel here performing jobs that they normally wouldn't perform. They have never been asked to perform under this amount of pressure in a lifetime. The latest word on the remains of the late John F. Kennedy is that the autopsy is now being performed. When it is finished, the remains will be taken to Gawler's funeral home in Washington, D.C. This is Don Herman reporting from the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland.
And now we're beginning to get datelines and reports under date of Monday morning. We've already received such reports from Tokyo, and now we're beginning to get them from Europe, because the clock has turned past midnight. And from Berlin, this touching report from the western section of Berlin. Some 25,000 West Berliners, perhaps more, took part in a midnight torch procession in memory of President Kennedy. They marched to the City Hall, where Mayor Willy Brandt was to speak to them later. The march was called by student organizations, but people of all ages and all groups turned out. Many of them wore black armbands of mourning. Some people in the City Hall crowd carried a large white banner with this inscription: President Kennedy is dead. He will continue to live in our hearts. His words were, I am a Berliner. The outpouring of reaction from all over the world is truly remarkable. General Francisco Franco, one we hadn't heard of before now, or hadn't heard from, broke off a cabinet meeting when he heard of the news and issued a statement expressing his sorrow. Yugoslav's President Tito telephoned the U.S. Charge in Belgrade to express condolences. Ex-Prime Minister Harold Macmillan of Britain said, when the news came, the whole world was stunned. It seemed impossible, incredible. And now the familiar voice of an American who has often visited President Kennedy in the White House, a man who doesn't share the president's religious beliefs. We take you now to Bob Taylor at station WLOS, Asheville, North Carolina, for an interview with the evangelist Billy Graham.
This is Bob Taylor at WLOS in Asheville, North Carolina. A short time ago, we had Dr. Billy Graham in our WLOS studios, and this is what he had to say concerning the death of President Kennedy.
First of all, I would like, please, your immediate reaction to this tragedy.
Well, of course, like millions of Americans, I was shocked. There was a great sense of personal loss, because by television, the president has been in our homes so many times, and we felt that he was a part of our family. And when something like this takes place, we feel the sense of personal loss, I think, greater than perhaps other generations when these things have taken place. For example, when Garfield or McKinley were assassinated. And I have been all day asked my reaction. I'm almost inarticulate, because it's almost impossible to express one's emotions and one's feelings at a time like this. I went immediately to prayer. I have been in prayer off and on all afternoon. Subconsciously, I've been in prayer constantly. The Apostle Paul says to pray without ceasing. And of course, we cannot help but ask why God would allow such a thing like this to take place. And this testifies once again to what the Bible says, that man's heart is deceitful and evil. Who can know it? And some evil, twisted brain has been masterminded by Satan, I'm sure, to do this terrible thing.
This is Bob Taylor at WLOS in Asheville, North Carolina, and now back to NBC in New York.
The tribute of an outstanding Protestant evangelist to the outstanding lay Catholic of the world, President John F. Kennedy. And now we have later details on events in Washington. Sorry, I moved a little too fast there. And I'm glad we now have an opportunity to take note of the way places referred to President Kennedy in their statements of tribute. I think perhaps one of the outstanding ones was Jfk'S. He's Secretary General of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He's a Dutchman. He's a very definite European-type citizen, but he is also for NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, and he's for it strong. The minute he was told of the death of the president, he exclaimed, "How I admired the man, not only as a head of state, but also personally." It's a tragic loss for the whole Western world. and Paul Henri Spock, another Dutchman who had been a friend of the United States, a cosmopolitan Westerner, if we may so dub him, refused to say anything at all. "What can I say?" he said. "It is awful news." And the Swedish Prime Minister, perhaps we haven't relayed his message to you yet, Tage Erlander. He made a radio speech tonight to his people about the president's death, and he called it a terrible disaster, not only for the American people, but for all of us who believe in the ideals he fought for and gave his life for. This from a neutral country that doesn't belong to the North Atlantic Alliance. And now, for those further details concerning a very tragically busy Washington, we take you to an old veteran, a young veteran, Ray Scherer at the White House.
Morgan, we have just heard word that the body of President Kennedy is now on its way here to the White House. It will be taken to the East Room. It will lie in repose there from 10 o'clock tomorrow until 6 o'clock tomorrow. And then it will lie in state in the rotunda of the Capitol on Sunday and Monday. As you know, it was taken from the airplane to the Walter Reed Army Hospital. It was then prepared for burial and is now on its way back here. The President's immediate family will be present tomorrow from 10 to 11 in the East Room. Members of the Cabinet, members of the Executive Branch, and close personal friends will arrive at the East Room from 11 to 2 in the afternoon. Justices of the Supreme Court will arrive from 2 to 2:30. From 2:30 to 5 tomorrow, members of the Senate, the House of Representatives, and governors are scheduled to arrive at the East Room. Members of the Diplomatic Corps will follow between 5 and 6. On Sunday, the President's body will be moved from the White House in an official cortege to the rotunda of the Capitol at 1 o'clock, and there it will lie in state until 9 p.m. Monday night, and then again from 9 to 10 on Monday. There is no word here on the funeral arrangements, but on the burial arrangement, but we are told that the family plot is in Boston, and that is the most likely place. That's the news at the White House. Ray Scherer, NBC News at the White House.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, if I may, a hard-lead wrap-up to refresh our minds on the main factors of this tragic, important, historic event. From Dallas, Texas, a hidden gunman assassinated President Kennedy with a high-powered rifle today. 3 shots reverberated. Blood sprang from the president's face. He fell face downward in the back seat of his car. His wife clutched his head and tried to lift it. She cried, "Oh, no." Half an hour later, John F. Kennedy was dead, and the United States had a new president, Lyndon B. Johnson. Within the hour in Dallas, the police had arrested a 24-year-old man after a Dallas policeman had been killed. Homicide Captain Will Fritz says tonight witnesses had identified the man as the slayer of the policeman, but the Dallas detective said it has not been established that the man killed the president. No police authorities in Dallas will remark about the fingerprints, whether any were found on the rifle that did the slaying. The man under arrest is Harvey Lee Oswald, or Lee Harvey Oswald of Fort Worth. 4 years ago, he left the United States, applied for Russian citizenship. For reasons unknown to us, it was not granted. He returned to the United States with a Russian wife. They have 2 children. Oswald at first denied he had shot anybody. Later he admitted that he had owned a pistol that shot a policeman near a theater where he was arrested in the suburbs of Dallas. And in Washington, to complete briefly our wrap-up of the report, Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the burdens of the presidency tonight and immediately won a pledge of bipartisan cooperation from congressional leaders in the dark days to follow President Kennedy's assassination. The new president took over with an appeal for the help of God and the American people. He held a mid-evening meeting with House and Senate leaders of both parties after conferring with several leading administrative officials. Mr. Johnson was only a few cars back when an assassin's bullet felled his predecessor in Dallas, Texas, in a motorcade. As we have reported to you earlier, the Mexican government has closed the entire border with the United States. It has been made clear informally to reporters in Mexico City that the purpose is to prevent the escape of anyone who may be a suspect in the assassination across that border, because such an escape would be an obvious attempt by an assassin. For more on that story, we take you now to Barry Simmons in San Diego for a report on the closing of the Mexican border.
Moments after the assassination of President Kennedy, the Mexican government ordered the long line of international borders separating the two countries closed. American authorities were at a loss to explain the border closing to traffic lines of tourists streaming into Baja California for the weekend. Mexican officials at Tijuana would only say that orders had been received from Mexico City and that street barricades would not be removed for at least 72 hours. As traffic snarled, tempers flared. Tensions eased when Mexican border officials permitted Americans to return to the United States and Mexicans working in the United States who could show proof of residence in nearby Tijuana were allowed to return to their homes. Tonight, the Red Cross has established an emergency care center in a schoolyard near the border, and police are working double duty in an effort to untangle the increasing traffic maze. Barry Simmons in San Diego.
In Mexico City, the authorities report absolutely no change in the situation. They're keeping that border closed until they know what happened about the death of the President of the United States.
The NBC radio network will stay on the air with continuous coverage until 1:05 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will resume broadcasting at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Saturday, tomorrow, with continuous coverage. We pause 10 seconds for station identification.
Wlw-Radio Cincinnati joins its listeners in an expression of deep sorrow on the death of our president.
There are two principals in this deep tragedy. The late President John Kennedy and the president who took the oath of office in Dallas, Texas late today, Lyndon Johnson. There are two other persons closer than any other citizen in the world or in the United States. They are, of course, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy and Lady Bird Johnson, the wife of President Lyndon Johnson. It seems now many of us know about Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy. I would say that fewer of us know about Lady Bird Johnson, because she has not occupied as prominent a position in the Kennedy administration, even though she's been with her husband very often, all the way through everything. As a matter of fact, for 30 years, Lady Bird Johnson has been at her husband's side in Washington, packing his bags for campaign trips, standing with him on social receiving lines, taking notes for him in the shorthand she learned in college. Today, she was with Lyndon Johnson on the campaign trail in Dallas when that assassin's bullet killed President Kennedy and made her husband the 36th President of the United States. Mrs. Johnson was born Claudia Alta Taylor, her family name, on December the 22nd, 1912. No one has called her Claudia Alta since she was 2 years old. A nursemaid nicknamed her Lady Bird. As such, her initials conform to those of the rest of the family, L.B. Johnson. Their daughters are Linda Bird, 19, and Lucy Baines, 16. There's Lyndon B., of course, and the family's ranch at Johnson City, Texas, is the LBJ Ranch. The daughter of a wealthy Texas rancher, Thomas Jefferson Taylor, Mrs. Johnson studied journalism at the University of Texas, took enough education courses to qualify her as a second-grade teacher. She was prepared with shorthand, typing, business courses to go into work as a secretary if need be. One date with Johnson in 1934, she was 21 then and he was 26, changed all that. One date with Lyndon Johnson. Johnson asked her to marry him. Mrs. Johnson now recalls, or did some time ago, "I thought it was some kind of a joke," she said. But she married him 2 months later. Lyndon Johnson in those days was just starting out in politics as secretary to a Texas congressman. The political pace quickened, and for 24 years, Mrs. Johnson stumped Texas in her husband's races for the House and the Senate. Like many another politician's wife, she has readily admitted this. She has said, "I am not deeply informed on political issues." That is definitely an understatement. When the idea of Johnson for president came up at the 1956 convention 7 years ago, Mrs. Johnson said, "I regard the job with awe." Mrs. Johnson worries about her husband's health. There is the memory of his heart attack in 1955. And she says very frequently, "I worry about Lyndon because, well, he simply works too hard and too long." As the wife of a vice president, Mrs. Johnson's role expanded far beyond the confines of Texas and Washington. She has toured the world, entertained a Russian astronaut, and occasionally she has pinch hit for Jacqueline Kennedy. Most people describe Mrs. Johnson as calm and unruffled. Yet often there's a hint of tension about her. With her husband's government role so heavy, Mrs. Johnson has had at times to serve as father and mother to their daughters. Linda's a sophomore at the University of Texas. Lucy attends the National Cathedral School for Girls in Washington. Last June the 28th, this year, word got out that Linda Bird was engaged to Ensign Bernard Rosenbach, a Texan. He was graduated from the Naval Academy in 1962. No wedding date has been set. A spokesman for Johnson's has said, since Linda Bird intends to finish college, there probably won't be a marriage right away. Mrs. Johnson flies regularly to Texas for a change of scene. She takes care of business interests as the head of the Austin radio television station. And that's a station the Johnsons purchased many years ago as a hedge against the uncertainties of political employment. In March 1960, when Lyndon Johnson was seeking the presidential nomination, Mrs. Johnson was asked what she actually liked to do. She replied, "I'd just like to go home and live in Austin and have a regular, solid sort of life. Lots of time for the children, and go to church and participate in civic and cultural life of Austin." This, of course, now seems beyond the realm of possibility for some time to come, because Lyndon Baines Johnson, Baines, that is B-A-I-N-E-S, will be President of the United States at least until January 1965. President Kennedy had served a little over half of his term. The police of Dallas, Texas, to resume the spot reporting of the news. The police of Dallas, Texas know exactly where the gunman who slew President Kennedy hid in ambush. They're questioning a suspect who was on the scene at that time. That's the word. Lee Harvey Oswald is the man, the same man they've got under arrest right now in Dallas Police Headquarters. Captain Will Fritz of the Dallas Police Homicide Department says it has been established that Oswald had been in the building from which the shots were fired at the president at the time they were fired. This man, as we've previously learned, had worked in this building. It was a warehouse, a storage point for school textbooks. And it was unoccupied at the time. It was undergoing some sort of repair or refurbishing or extension. And Oswald got himself a job in that warehouse. And his supervisor, whom he's been working with for some days or weeks, his supervisor told the police that at noon, Oswald was in the building. Now, it has been established by others that Oswald was not only in the building at noon when his supervisor saw him, but he was in the building at 12:30 when the president was shot. And now we've established that the shots came from the 5th floor, not the 6th floor. It's a 6-story building, all right. The shots were fired from a 45-degree angle. The assassin was 100 yards from the president. His view was unobstructed. He used that .30 caliber rifle with telescopic sights. Now, there's been some doubt about that. Some say a Mauser German rifle had been used to shoot the president. Now, we're informed it was a .30 caliber rifle with telescopic sights. It can be noted, I think, fairly, that Lee Harvey Oswald was a sharpshooter in the Marines. He had become a marksman. The police report they found the rifle that did the execution, or the assassination. It was partly hidden behind some books. It's a bolt-action model believed to be of Italian make. Now, that's a .30 caliber rifle of Italian make. Also found were 3 spent cartridges, as we've reported before. And, again, repeating our previous reports, there were scraps of fried chicken around. It looked as if Oswald had been in the building for some time. The indication is that whoever shot President Kennedy sat for a long time, calmly fed himself on chicken, as he waited for the exact moment to shoot at the President of the United States near an underpass on a road leading from the center of Dallas toward the airport. Now, that theater where Oswald was arrested, you see, was some distance from the scene of the shooting. As a matter of fact, it's been established now by rechecking that the theater where the man was arrested is some 4 miles from the triple underpass where President Kennedy was shot. Just before 7 p.m. tonight, Captain Will Fritz, that's 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, said that Oswald had been identified from a police lineup as the man who shot Patrolman Tippett. Now, that's further confirmation that Oswald was the man who shot the patrolman near the theater. He said, the police captain said, that an eyewitness had made the identification, and Oswald himself has admitted that he owned the pistol that shot the policeman. But he said, I don't know what you're talking about, when they asked him about the assassination of the president. As Oswald was returned from the lineup in front of witnesses, a reporter shouted at him, "Did you kill the president?" Oswald replied in a loud voice, "No, I did not kill the president. I did not kill anyone." Well, he's already practically admitted he shot the policeman. The police now say that Oswald, who worked in that book depository building, had lived in Russia, married a Russian woman. November 1st, 1959, he applied for Russian citizenship. It was denied. Now, perhaps we can get further detail and catch up with the story, this tremendously dramatic, tragic story of Lee Harvey Oswald. We take you once again to Pierce Allman at station WFAA in Dallas.
Morgan, the latest report we have from City Hall is the fact that Lee Oswald will be charged before midnight tonight. This announcement came from the district attorney's office. He has not been charged as of this time with the assassination. He has definitely been charged with the murder of the patrolman. But this word is that he will be charged, and the charge will read roughly like this: that H. Lee Oswald did, willfully and with malice aforethought, kill one John F. Kennedy as a part of an international communist plot. That's all the information we have to this time, Morgan.
I'm sorry, folks. That's the first little catch we've had in our transmission to our engineers tonight. These men have made infinite numbers of switches, and maybe that was somebody else's error. For the moment, I'll credit to the phone company, but it's been wonderful working with all of these men, with only one miss all night long. We were reporting about Oswald, and we now have Pierce Allman with a clear line. Pierce, you're there, aren't you still?
Yes, Morgan, right here.
There are several matters that are not quite cleared up down there, as you know. Now, as a part of an international communist plot, can you give us any direction or thoughts? We now have it that the Mexican government has definitely closed the border, indicating that they've been in communication with our federal security officials, indicating also that they themselves suspect some kind of an international plot. We note that from Havana, the Cuban radio waited for a very long time before they reported the original bulletin that President Kennedy had been shot and killed. Now, I'm wondering if we are justified at this time in putting any twos and twos together. An international communist plot. Won't the police give you any clue, or do they feel they must conceal everything?
I'm sorry, Morgan. I couldn't get your question. Evidently, we have a technical problem down here. Can you repeat it?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I hope the boys leave the line up now. I say, is there any possible indication of a connection between this international communist plot, the fact that the Havana radio was extremely late in coming aboard with a bulletin? Every other nation in the world came out immediately with a bulletin on this. Havana radio held this story for some hours before they gave it to the Cuban people, and now we have the government of Mexico, incidentally the only government in the Western Hemisphere that has direct air connections with Cuba and has refused to pull them down. The Mexican government has closed its border with the United States, and officials there frankly state to us they've done it because they suspect that assassins of the president may be trying to get across the border into Mexico and escape that way. Now, do the police there give you any justification for suspecting that this is a very large plot, or whether or not it's a very small one, and that Lee Harvey...
As a matter of reference, Morgan, we have no positive word from the police department concerning the number involved or just why they used this particular wording. The charge will actually be filed by the county authorities here in Dallas, the district attorney's office. And we have been trying to, for some time, get in touch with the assistant district attorney, Bill Alexander, who will, I understand, do the charging. This wording came from our reporter, Vic Robertson, at City Hall. And as to the legalities, the formal charge, we don't have anything. They aren't saying anything yet, I would assume, until the man is definitely charged.
So then we're left to conclude without any doubt that the district attorney of Dallas believes there is a plot. A plot means more than one. So they must suspect very definitely that more than one person is involved in the assassination of the President of the United States, and certainly in the murder of the policeman. Is that about all you have there at this time?
That's it, Morgan. Right up to this moment, we will be in touch.
With WFAA and its very able staff later. And now we have a revised version of the capture of the suspect in the president's murder. The details of how Lee H. Oswald, or H. Lee Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald, was apprehended. We now have it as a certainty, a police report. That Patrolman J.D. Tippett, this is an informal police report, not one of their official documents. Patrolman J.D. Tippett of the Dallas Police Force stopped a man on the street about 4 miles from the scene of the assassination. Now, we know that the assassination was 4 miles from the theater where Oswald was captured. Well, that means he was very close to the theater when this happened. The man drew a gun and shot Tippett. Then he fled as neighbors notified the police. A few minutes later, the cashier of the Texas Theater, 5 blocks from where the patrolman had been killed, telephoned Dallas Police Headquarters that a man had run into the theater. His description matched that of Tippett's killer. 4 policemen were dispatched to the theater. The movie was in progress, but only a dozen or so people were there. An usher led Patrolman M.N. McDonald to where Oswald was sitting. The man jumped up and said, "This is it." That's Oswald said that. He pulled out a snub-nosed revolver and tried to shoot McDonald, but the gun misfired. The 4 officers all jumped on him. He fought wildly until they had handcuffed him and dragged him to a car. Previously, our reports were that 2 officers had jumped the man. Well, apparently they smothered him with 4. Now, Oswald has confessed to the police that he owned the gun that shot Patrolman Tippett. So the 4 miles are yet to be accounted for, and we have the mystery of the plot. Was he alone? Were others with him? The Dallas District Attorney definitely suspects it's a widespread plot, and the Mexican government has shown that it joins the Dallas District Attorney in this suspicion. The commercial capital of the Eastern world, so far as the Western world is concerned at this time, is a place called Hong Kong, one that's filled with intrigue and also with refugees and with Western sympathizers, with not even a coastline separating the city from Red China. It is under British protection, as you know. There has been a definite reaction in Hong Kong. We take you now to Hong Kong, China, and Ian Stewart.
The people and governments of Asia reacted with shock and dismay to the news of the death of President Kennedy today. The news of the assassination broke as most of Asia slept, and telephones were soon waking heads of state in Asia's capitals with the first reports, which many found hard to believe. Most leaders reacted immediately, like the governor of this British colony, Sir Robert Black, who cancelled all his public engagements and ordered the city to mourn the late president with its flags at half-mast. From communist China, there was no immediate reaction. But Peking, which has been as vituperative about the late president as his predecessors, is unlikely to be moved to reasonableness by the stunning event. This is Ian Stewart for NBC News, Hong Kong.
Thank you very much. From away across the Pacific. It is interesting to note the reaction of President Johnson to his new office. As you have been told, he maintained his offices in the Executive Office Building across the street from the White House, formerly was State War and Navy, and he chose to meet the congressional leaders there. It's a familiar setting, and he's not happy exactly with his offices in the Congress because actually he is an executive officer. Congress has always been suspicious of the executive officer in their midst, not because of himself, but because of the fact that he has no powers in the Congress, and Congress is supreme in its own precincts. So the Vice President had offices there, but he rarely visited those offices. I would like to note that when President Johnson left the airplane that brought him from Dallas to Washington, he was apparently, for him, very shy. He was diffident, his face was grim, and he acted as if he were out of place there. And he was hesitant as he left the airplane. And as he approached the microphone that had been set up for him for his first statement to the American people, slowly, almost in a meandering way, as if he were bemused, he made his way to the cluster of microphones that had been set up, and his first public pronouncement. His wife, Lady Bird, stood by his side, and perhaps you would like us to repeat his very brief statement at this time. President Lyndon Johnson's statement to the American people, his first statement. This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's. President Johnson had written that statement on his way from Dallas to Washington. Just before he wrote it, when he and Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Johnson were aboard the presidential plane, he had taken the oath of office from a woman federal judge. And he said almost as soon as the oath was taken, in order that there be no gap of awkwardness, he said, all right, let's get out of here to Washington. We've given you many, many statements by many organizations, people, world government leaders. I'd like at this time to give you 3 statements. One of them comes from the American Communist Party. The other one comes from the John Birch Society. And another one comes from a powerful labor leader in the United States. The communist statement says this: all true Americans, in tribute to your husband, incidentally, it was addressed to Mrs. Kennedy, will not only condemn this political murder, but will also rededicate themselves with greater strength to the struggle for the democratic character of our country. As you know, all communists, including American communists, use the word democratic in the exact opposite meaning that we have for it. They mean totalitarian government ruling in the name of democracy. The John Birch Society spoke through its founder, Robert Welch. Robert Welch sent a message to Mrs. Kennedy. It says this, we quote it: I wish to express our deep sorrow at so untimely a loss to our nation of its youngest elected president, and to convey our sincere and heartfelt sympathy in your overwhelming personal loss. Walter Reuther, the chairman of the auto workers, their president, had this comment, very brief. The civilized world has been shocked by this brutal and heinous crime. All those who yearn for peace have suffered a grievous loss in the death of this gallant champion of human freedom. Walter Reuther had urged his union and his parent union, the AFL-CIO, to a greater and faster transition as he saw it, into total civil rights in the United States. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, faces a somber ritual tomorrow at 11 a.m., speaking for all the people of the United States, or rather acting in their stead. He will view the body of the president as it lies in repose in the East Room of the White House. It's an interesting commentary that President Johnson's greatest political love, and the political isn't right, his greatest governmental love for the last, well, it's more than his term in office as vice president, it must be the last 4 to 6 years, has been the space age. He has made the most eloquent, the most dramatic statements about it. He has been colorful in describing the necessity for our march in space. He has been instrumental in persuading President Kennedy to stress our conquest of space at times when many have thought we were spending too much money in space. Now, what about the future? If this man was even more wedded to space exploration than President Kennedy. We take you now to Peter Jfk'S in Washington, our Pentagon correspondent.
The late President Kennedy's most vigorous advisor on outer space was a man named Lyndon Johnson. As head of the Space Council, he's been acutely aware of the tremendous possibilities the use of space can hold for mankind. In fact, I'm told President Johnson was always after Mr. Kennedy to go even faster in space than he did. It was Lyndon Johnson who in 1961 recommended the initiation of the moon program that led to the Kennedy speech of May 1961, in which he outlined the U.S. plan to land a man on the moon in this decade. Every time he could, President Johnson over the last 2 years has urged an expansion of the space program for both defensive security and for civilian benefits. He has said many times that the U.S. public will get back $2 or $3 for every dollar it invests in space. Many of his ideas on space were included in President Kennedy's speeches on that general theme. Senator Lyndon Johnson, as chairman of the Senate Preparedness Committee back in 1957, recommended, along with the rest of the committee members, that the U.S. move ahead rapidly to develop a 1 million-pound thrust booster, which the Eisenhower administration later turned down. He was chairman of the Senate Space Committee. In the military field, he was a leading member of the Senate Armed Services Committee for several years, strongly anti-communist, constantly pushing for development of long-range ballistic missiles. He was also a champion of an improved Navy and an expanded Army. During the Cuba crisis, President Johnson sat in on all of the top-level military planning. He backed the Kennedy blockade plan, willing to risk nuclear war in that instance. Mr. Johnson is a strong admirer of Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, which has given rise to speculation that Mr. McNamara may continue to serve on in the new Johnson cabinet. President Johnson has called McNamara the nation's best Secretary of Defense and the strongest man in the Kennedy cabinet. He was the first cabinet member President Johnson talked with when he arrived back here in Washington today. He will need him, what with the problems he'll face in the Pentagon. Wherever the Johnson foreign policy takes this country, his military policy is expected to go before. Peter Jfk'S, NBC News, Washington.
A little while ago, we told you that the student organizations in Berlin had organized a torchlight procession, a very slow processional, in West Berlin to show they paid tribute to the late President John Kennedy. Well, now it's morning. They called it a midnight torch procession because it would be underway at midnight. Now it's morning. First there were a few thousand. Then there were 25,000. And by the time the procession reached the Berlin City Hall, more than 60,000 West Berliners stood in complete silence after midnight. The freedom bell tolled in mourning for the dead president. Mayor Willie Brandt called for a minute of silence as the bell chimed out in the rainy night. That Freedom Bell is a replica of our own Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, and it's a gift by United States citizens to the people of West Berlin. Mayor Brandt addressed the crowd. His eyes were red, and his voice shook with emotion. It was obvious he had prepared nothing. He spoke from his heart. Here above us on the balcony, he said, President Kennedy stood last June and told us that he was one of us, that he was a Berliner. We regard his death as our own loss. America has lost its president, and a tortured mankind has lost a man of whom so many people believed that he would show the road towards a just peace and a better life in the world. Berlin now puts its confidence in President Lyndon B. Johnson. President Johnson came here, said Willy Brandt, August 19, 1961, a few days after the Berlin Wall was built. In this hour of mourning, I greet President Johnson. The people in the rainy night before they began to disband. And now, back on our side of the Atlantic, there are more details available on the preparations for marks of mourning for the president. And we take you now to the story of the American flag on the passing of a president. We take you to Robert Abernathy on nationwide arrangements for mourning. He's in Washington.
This afternoon, shortly after word of the president's death came in, Undersecretary of State George Ball ordered all federal government flags lowered to half-staff and kept there for 1 month, until December 22nd. Mr. Ball was at that time the highest-ranking official of the executive branch in Washington. The Secretary of State was en route to Japan. There is about other matters much uncertainty. We don't know yet, for instance, about the schedule of the federal departments or of the Supreme Court, nor has there been any announcement of the plans of Congress. But at the airport this evening, waiting for the presidential plane to return with the body and the new president, I spoke with Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader in the Senate. He felt that so many members of Congress had known President Kennedy personally that Congress would probably recess to permit them to attend the funeral. After that, however, Senator Dirksen did not think Congress would go home early. He pointed out that there is business that must be done, appropriations bills, for instance, which must be passed. He implied that Congress would stay in session as planned until December 20th. These are meager details so far, but they are representative. Washington is either mourning or planning those ceremonies of the next few days which will honor Mr. Kennedy and then lay his body to rest. It's really too soon for other arrangements. This word has just come in, Morgan, from the White House. President Johnson has just left his office to go to his home in Washington for the night. This is Robert Abernathy, NBC News in Washington.
Evidently, President Lyndon Johnson feels it would not be fitting. As a matter of fact, he would be personally more comfortable to go to his own home rather than to stay in the White House. He did the same thing in his office arrangements. He went to his own office in the old State War and Navy building to conduct the first business he had as President of the United States, a meeting with his cabinet, that part of it that's in the United States, and a meeting with our security officers, the Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and McGeorge Bundy, the late President Kennedy's assistant.
The NBC radio network will stay on the air with continuous coverage until 1:05 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will resume broadcasting at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Saturday morning with continuous coverage. We pause 10 seconds for station identification.
Wlw-Radio joins its listeners in an expression of deep sorrow for the death of our president. WLW, Cincinnati.
You've just heard a few seconds ago that President Lyndon Johnson had left his office in the State War Navy building, the executive offices of the White House, they are now, to go home. We'd like to take you now to NBC's Nancy Dickerson at President Lyndon Johnson's home in Washington.
Here at President Lyndon Johnson's home in Spring Valley on the outside of Washington, there are crowds of neighbors, children, reporters, and policemen. The neighbors lined up outside keep asking, will the president come home here tonight? There have been comments that in this wooded residential area, the security is very difficult. It would be difficult to guard the new president. But there is a high wall, a wooden wall, around his mansion called the Elms. The gate leading to the Johnson home is closed. At the gatehouse, there is a private phone which rings constantly. That phone was installed during the Cuban crisis when security guards were put on. Extra ones were added at that time, and that's the phone that is so busy tonight here at 4040 52nd Street in Washington. So far, one station wagon was admitted up the driveway. It was carrying a television set. Inside, there are already many TV sets. All the lights are burning brightly. Inside also is the new First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson. It was she who so eloquently put it when she said, this whole tragedy, the whole thing is like a nightmare. Somehow, she added, we must find the strength to carry on. The President and Mrs. Johnson telephoned Mrs. Rose Kennedy en route here to Washington from the plane. They tried to comfort Mrs. Kennedy, but Mrs. Johnson broke down in sobs on the telephone conversation. Finally, Mrs. Johnson said, we are fortunate to have had him. The nation is fortunate to have had him for so long. This is Nancy Dickerson, NBC News, at President Lyndon Johnson's home in Washington.
About 10 minutes ago, we broke off coverage of the arrest of Oswald, Lee H. Oswald, or H. Lee Oswald, whichever it is. The report was that the district attorney of Dallas had already charged the man with the murder of a Dallas policeman on his way to a theater to hide, as he thought, among the audience. And we have the report that before midnight, Dallas time, this man will be charged with the murder of the President of the United States in an international communist plot. We'll have details on that later, but the questioning of this man by the police and by federal authorities offers, obviously, the most potent possibility in the way of clues as to what went on, whether this was a one-man or a two-man or a 100-man conspiracy. We take you now to Tom Pettit, NBC News in Dallas.
Dallas Police Chief J.E. Curry says 24-year-old Lee Oswald now is being questioned about the killing of President Kennedy. Chief Curry says Oswald denies the murder, but says he is, quote, a very good suspect. When transported in front of cameras and reporters a few moments ago, the suspect, Oswald, shouted, they're holding me because I was in the Soviet Union. The police won't let me have legal representation. Within the hour, Oswald has been charged with the murder of police officer J.D. Tippit, but according to police here now, he still steadfastly denies killing President Kennedy. The questioning at this hour continues. Tom Pettit, NBC News, at Dallas Police Headquarters.
We have a report from San Francisco. A few days ago, it was reported officially that the new ambassador to South Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., the liberal Republican, would return to Washington to report to President Kennedy either on Sunday or Monday of next week on the change in government there, on the takeover by the military leaders from the old Diem regime. Ambassador Lodge left Vietnam yesterday, and he arrived today in San Francisco on his way to report, as he thought at the time, to President Kennedy. NBC News, Dean Mell, our reporter in San Francisco, has been in touch. He reports that Ambassador Lodge says he will not submit a report he had prepared for President Kennedy to President Lyndon Johnson. Ambassador Lodge was scheduled to meet with the President in Washington on Sunday to turn over the report on conditions in South Vietnam following the recent revolution. Ambassador Lodge would give no further explanation other than to say he does not feel it would be appropriate to submit a report intended for President Kennedy to President Johnson. Ambassador Lodge was vice presidential candidate on the Republican ticket in 1960. He was personally selected by President Kennedy for the troubleshooting diplomatic mission to South Vietnam. Mr. Lodge says, however, he will visit Washington over the weekend to confer with State Department officials, and he adds that he plans to return to South Vietnam on Monday. It is easily understandable that he would not wish to report voluntarily to President Johnson, that he would rather wish to wait because he is not a Johnson appointee. It might even be presumptuous on his part. I suppose some people might feel that if Ambassador Lodge intruded into the situation, personal and official, in Washington at this time, he would rather be thrusting himself forward in some way. The ambassador, while he's not exactly a modest man, is certainly a man who would observe the amenities under all occasions and would not intrude into the very busy schedule of President Johnson at this time, unless, of course, it were extremely necessary. In that case, he could report to the Secretary of State, who will be in Washington shortly after midnight. He's due in with 5 other cabinet members who diverted their plane on the way to Tokyo for a trade visit, diverted the plane to Honolulu. There it was refueled, and it will be in Washington about midnight. Now, perhaps the one angle in this story that we have neglected, because it was more or less a beginning, and we have tried to keep you up with events, was the story of the early morning of the Kennedys in Dallas today. They arrived in San Antonio yesterday. They had several political meetings in San Antonio. The president made several speeches, and Dallas was his second stop on an intended 5-city tour of Texas. Well, this morning he got up very early because he had a breakfast date. Mrs. Kennedy did not join him immediately. At 8:45 a.m., the president walked bareheaded and without a coat through a misty rain. He went into a parking lot across the street from Fort Worth's Hotel Texas. He was in Fort Worth in the early morning hours. He spoke there to a cheering throng of Democrats. They were the Democrats who could not get tickets to see him at a breakfast appearance earlier and apologized, or later it is, because Mrs. Kennedy was not with him. He made a very smiling apology. He said, Mrs. Kennedy is organizing herself. He paused very briefly and says, it takes longer. He didn't add the superfluous remark that it takes longer for women to get ready. At 9 a.m., the president and Mrs. Kennedy attended the breakfast in the Hotel Texas, sponsored by the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. Mrs. Kennedy walked in some minutes late, and her entrance brought tremendous applause from 2,500 guests. Both of them got presents at the Chamber of Commerce meeting in Fort Worth. Texas boots for both of them, and a Texas hat for the president. President Kennedy declined to put on the hat in public. He joked that he would wear it in the White House next Monday. He's been a shy man with a hat. In deference to hat manufacturers, he had, on occasion, worn a hat, but he didn't like it. At 10:35 a.m. this morning, the president and Mrs. Kennedy left the Texas Hotel by automobile for Carswell Air Force Base near Fort Worth. There they were to board an airplane for a short flight to Texas. At 11:37 a.m., or to Dallas. At 11:37 a.m., the presidential plane landed at Dallas's Love Field. Mrs. Kennedy emerged from the plane smiling. She shook hands with airport greeters. She carried that bouquet of red roses that clashed with her pink dress. Young men in the crowd shouted, "Hey, Jackie," and squeezed forward with a closer look. Several young girls were screaming over the president as he made his way through the crowd. There was no sign of any anti-Kennedy sentiment, nor was there at any time today in Dallas. The party left in a motorcade that was to take them over an 11-mile route, including downtown Dallas. At 12:30, the motorcade approached that triple underpass that feeds into Stemmons Expressway, and the tragedy occurred. President Johnson, we hear from Washington, has arrived at his home just outside of the city. We take you now to Nancy Dickerson, at President Johnson's home in Spring Valley, Washington.
President Lyndon Baines Johnson just arrived home at his estate here on the outskirts of Washington in the Spring Valley section. He was preceded by a motorcycle caravan. His entourage whipped up the hill leading to the Elms, which is the name of his estate. There were something like 7 motorcycles that preceded him, several Secret Service men. The regular Secret Service car was right behind. You could see guns. This is something not normally in sight when you see Secret Service men protecting the president. The president, Mr. Johnson, sat on the outside of the car. He looked weary, but he raised his hand to wave acknowledgement as he drove up the driveway. Seated next to him in this crowded car was William Moyer. This is the deputy director of the Peace Corps now, but in the past, Bill Moyer has been the president's aide. He was with him all during the campaign. President Johnson has now arrived home. He's inside. The place is surrounded by Secret Service people, and as always happens in tragedies of this case, the reporters, the telephone company, everyone is here trying to install equipment so that broadcasting can take place from the home. The neighbors are standing around, they're watching. There is much excitement, but there is a subdued shock treatment. It's a sense of reverence as the people stand around wondering what next. This is Nancy Dickerson of NBC News in Washington at President Lyndon Johnson's home.
And now, if we may return to an angle concerning Harvey Lee Oswald, who has been arrested, who has been charged with the murder of a Dallas policeman and will be charged, by word of the district attorney in Dallas, with the murder of President Kennedy. The man has a fascinating record. We've heard a great deal of it about how he was a Marine, went to Russia, wanted to become a citizen in 1957, returned to the United States in 1959. He was an admirer of Fidel Castro and all of that. Now we have an opportunity to shed more light on the background of this man, to round out one phase of his life and to give us an insight into his character. It so happened that NBC's Joseph Michaels, who is a New York reporter with NBC now, was stationed in Russia in 1959. He knows a great deal about this man. As a matter of fact, he has interviewed a man who knows H. Lee Oswald very well. Here is Joseph Michaels in New York.
The man I talked to, Carlos Brinquier, a Cuban, knows Oswald much better than he'd like to, as a matter of fact, Morgan. We can talk about Russia a bit later if you like. Right now, I'm interested in Oswald, the double agent. Carlos Brinquier lives in New Orleans. I think the best thing to do is just to run the conversation as we held it a few moments ago. Mr. Brinquier, you are a member of the Cuban Students Directorate in New Orleans, is that right?
Yes, sir. I am the local delegate here in New Orleans.
What does your organization do?
Well, we are an underground organization, an exile organization of students who are fighting against Castro communism, and we are raiding installation in Havana and trying to free Cuba.
I understand that you have had some contact with Mr. Oswald, is this right?
That's right, you're right.
When did this take place?
Well, this started in the beginning of August this year. Mr. Oswald came to my office here in the city of New Orleans and offered me his service as ex-Marine of the United States to fight against Castro or to train us to fight against Castro.
What did he say he could do for you?
Well, he said that he has a lot of experience as ex-Marine, and if in any moment we need persons to fight against Castro, he could fight by himself, or if not, he can show us how to fight because he has a guerrilla training and all those things.
What did he say was his interest in helping you?
Because he think that communism was a bad thing, and he was like to see Cuba free from Castro.
Did he say any nasty things about Castro?
Yeah, he told bad things about Castro.
And what did he ask you for anything?
Well, no, he didn't ask me for anything. He gave to me a book, a guidebook for Marines, with his name in the top of the first page. telling to me that that book could help us to be trained to fight against Castro. He was interested in the Cuban Student Directorate organization, but as a revolutionary organization, we never talked too much with a person who really we don't know.
What do you mean he was interested? How did he show his interest?
Well, because he said that that the Cuban Student Directorate was making raids in Cuba and was infiltrating people in Cuba, and he will be glad to work with us.
Did you meet him? Did you ever see him again?
Yes, sir. About 3 days later, one Cuban came to my office and told me that there was a person distributing propaganda in the 700 block of Canal Street, which is the main street here in New Orleans. We went over there. That was the August 9th, 1963. And we went over there, and I was shocked when I found that the same guy who was distributing the pro-communist propaganda in Canal Street was Lee H. Oswald.
You couldn't have been mistaken?
Pardon?
I said you couldn't have been mistaken about this?
No, it wasn't no mistake. And when he saw me, he smiled and tried to salute me. But I was really shocked and really angry because he had a sign telling Viva Fidel, hand off Cuba, and distributing some papers from the Fair Play for Cuba committee, because he was something that I knew later, that he was at that moment the chairman Fair Play for Cuba committee here in New Orleans.
At the same time that he was trying to infiltrate your organization?
Pardon? The same guy, exactly, the same person.
And at the same time?
At the same time, that's right.
What happened after that?
Well, we had trouble over there because we broke his propaganda, and we threw it away. In one moment, I was trying to hit him, but he crossed his arms down and told me, okay, Carlos, if you want to hit me, hit me. I thought in that moment that if I would hit him, he will appear as a victim, and that he was trying that I hit him. That in that case, I didn't hit him, and the police came and brought all of us to the prison here in the city, in the first district here in the city, and we paid a bond of $25 each one.
Did you ever see him again?
Well, yes. 3 days later, we appeared in the second municipal court here in New Orleans, and in the trial, the judge dismissed the charges against us and fined him in $10 for disturbing the peace. He paid the fine and went free.
And was that the end of your connection with him?
No, sir. A few days later, one newsman, Bill Stockey, from here from New Orleans, contacted me because he wanted to know his address, the Oswald addresses, and I gave him, and the newsman told me that he will make an interview of Mr. Oswald. I disagree with the newsman, and I told him that I prefer to have a debate, because having a debate, we can show both parts of history. And the newsman agreed with me, and we held the debate on August 21st, 1963, at Wlw-Radio here in New Orleans.
Is that the debate that we have already heard on NBC?
That's right.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Rinkier.
You are welcome, and I'm sorry very much as Cuban about what happened.
God bless you. Thank you.
Well, Joe Michaels, that interview you had a few minutes ago with the Cuban anti-Castro man is, I think the title of it should be The Double Agent Exposed. But now, your experience, Joe, with Oswald, oddly enough, goes back much further. Much further. Yes, you were NBC's correspondent in Moscow, 19 Moscow, in the man 59. The man went there. Stayed 2 years. And we've heard a great deal about why he left or why he did not become a Russian citizen and so on. I wonder if you couldn't throw considerable light on that.
Well, I can throw some light on it anyway. I have here from my own files an item called Harvey Lee Oswald Defector from 31st October 1959, and I'll read that to you.
Now, wait a minute. This is an item that you wrote at that time in Moscow?
This is an item I broadcast to NBC. I said, a 20-year-old former Marine from Texas has come to Moscow with the proclaimed intention of becoming a Soviet citizen. Harvey Lee Oswald of 4936 Collingwood Avenue in Fort Worth, informed the American Embassy here that he has applied to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR for Soviet citizenship. Oswald has not as yet renounced his American citizenship, but when embassy officials spoke to him, he was apparently quite firm about his decision. Oswald was recently discharged from the Marine Corps, the only job he has ever held, and immediately, it seems, came to the Soviet Union, arriving here on the 15th of this month. He is still, that is at that time, in Moscow, but so far has not been prepared to talk with members of the press. Now, shortly after that, in November 23rd, No, it was less than that. It was just a couple of days after that. One correspondent did manage to talk to him, and that was Aline Mosby of UPI.
And that was, again, still in 1959.
That was, I think, the next day or the day after. Aline has written about it again. She was, I guess, able to get in because Aline is an extremely attractive young woman, and he probably didn't expect any women. He had already rejected a couple of correspondents. He lived at that time in the same hotel at which I was staying, by the way, at the Hotel Metropole. I was not able to get in. Aline says, looking back at her notes, that the same thing that I have written here, but that she went in and talked to him, and she said he talked to her very easily, and he was an intense young man. She said that she deemed him at the time very determined, but unsure of himself, naive, and emotionally unbalanced. He said that Soviet officials had informed him that either in the event of acceptance or rejection of his first application, he would not have to leave Moscow. Now, an interesting sidelight on that is that the general consensus is that the Russians didn't want him either. The Russians had had some experience with defectors who changed their minds. And by the time Oswald came along, they probably judged him unbalanced too. And even if he was a sympathizer and proclaimed himself a communist, they didn't care for his type. Men who defect once, of course, can defect again. And so therefore it is my belief, and was the belief of people at the embassy at the time and other correspondents with some experience, that Oswald was refused the citizenship which he had requested from the Russians. By the way, I do know at the time that embassy spokesman thought him at first just a naive young man and spoke to him very strongly and in fatherly fashion about what he was getting himself into, but he was determined, and America, unlike Russia, does not try to force people to stay American citizens. We would be, of course, substantially better off were Harvey Lee Oswald not one.
A very curious coincidence. I've forgotten the name of the young man who here in New York, as you may recall, wanted to become a Russian-type communist. He applied very hard to them, and they made quite a considerable inquiry about him. It was about 3 or 4 years ago, and after a certain length of time, they thought they could use him as an agent, and then they decided he was no good as an agent because he was, shall we say, a screwball. He was not to be trusted in any language, either as an agent or anything else, and he went to Cuba. The same kind of affection seems to have fastened itself upon this man here. A fellow who was rejected by the Russians, then fastened upon Fidel Castro as the great hero, the Messiah of the future. A very curious angle.
He had a very unhappy time of it in the Marine Corps, which in itself says nothing particularly, but in this case perhaps adds up with the weight of the evidence to show a disturbed, unbalanced, unhappy, and rather miserable creature.
A very interesting commentary. I'm sure if you were still in Moscow, you would be up as of Saturday morning Moscow time right now, along with a lot of other correspondents. I'd like to point out that we're beginning to receive dispatches concerning Premier Nikita Khrushchev from Moscow. The Soviet government seems to have gone out of its way, and I say gone out of its way, to report the Premier's action, because they never stay up late to help reporters with information unless they have a specific reason to do so. Isn't that about right, Joe? We have a report now concerning Premier Khrushchev. Saturday morning dateline, our second Saturday morning dateline from the European zone of correspondence. Premier Khrushchev is rushing back to Moscow by special train from the Ukraine. He had been there a few days, reasons unknown, but presumably on the agricultural crisis in Russia. He is rushing back because of the assassination of President Kennedy. That has been conveyed to reporters by the Russian government. And the Soviet leader has ordered Foreign Minister Gromyko to stand by to go to Washington to attend President Kennedy's funeral. And the newspaper Pravda has now been ordered to remake its front page on Saturday morning to eulogize the late president as a man of peace who was working, and we quote exactly what Pravda is saying, who was working toward a healthier international situation. And we'll be back with more about Russia in a few moments.
The NBC radio network will stay on the air with continuous coverage until 1 o'clock a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will resume broadcasting at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Saturday tomorrow with continuous coverage. We pause 10 seconds for station identification.
Wlw-Radio Cincinnati joins its listeners in an expression of deep sorrow on the death of our president.
And now we resume coverage of the situation in Moscow. As we've noted, Premier Khrushchev was out of the capital in the Ukraine, where he's been attending to some of the problems of the agricultural crisis in Russia. Andrei Gromyko personally telephoned United States Ambassador Floyd D. Kohler, as reported to you earlier. It was midnight Moscow time, 4 p.m. Friday, to express the shock and the greatest sympathy to the American people. He said condolences will be conveyed later at the highest level. And obviously he meant Mr. Khrushchev. And now he's got orders to come to Washington, Andrei Gromyko, Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union, to convey the condolences of the Russian government. Obviously, Mr. Khrushchev wants it known very definitely that the friendly spirit of the Soviet Union that appeared in the nuclear test ban treaty has not been abandoned, even though we've had trouble in Berlin and elsewhere with him since then. And now it's time, I believe, ladies and gentlemen, to point out that the White House has been a somberly busy place ever since President Kennedy was shot at 12:30 Central Standard Time today. Many hours have elapsed. Much has happened that will go into the history books of this country in extended fashion. Let us, therefore, at this time, have a resume, a recapitulation of what went on at the White House on this day. We take you to Richard Valeriani at the White House in Washington.
The White House is all but empty tonight. President Lyndon Johnson, who arrived here just 4 hours after President Kennedy was assassinated, worked until a few minutes ago in his vice presidential offices on the second floor of the Executive Office Building across the street from the White House. He is now in his own home in the district to spend the night. The widow of the slain president, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, are reportedly spending the night at Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the coffin bearing President Kennedy's body was taken. There is no word on where the Kennedy children are at this hour. There is uncertainty whether or not the coffin will be brought to the East Room of the White House tonight or tomorrow. A presidential aide says that it will remain at the hospital all night, but a priest from St. Matthew's Cathedral, where a pontifical requiem mass will be held Monday, said the casket will be brought to the White House sometime after midnight. It will be on view tomorrow for members of the family, President Johnson, cabinet members, and other high-ranking officials of the government. Arrangements for the funeral are being handled by the director of the Peace Corps, Sergeant Shriver, the late president's brother-in-law. For tomorrow's viewing, the casket will be flanked by 2 silver candle holders and by a kneeling rail. 3 busloads of an all-service honor guard in dress uniform have arrived at the White House, presumably to stand guard at President Kennedy's casket when it arrives. Before President Johnson left, the White House announced that he will meet with Secretary of State Dean Rusk at 9:30 tomorrow morning and with former President Eisenhower at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. President Johnson also discussed with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover the investigation of the assassination. He also talked with a doctor attending Governor Connally of Texas, who was wounded by the same sniper who killed the president. The governor's condition was reported as good. Earlier, President Johnson conferred with security officials with Defense Secretary McNamara and with McGeorge Bundy, a White House security advisor. He also met with legislative leaders who assured him of bipartisan support. Here at the White House now, crowds are still waiting across the street on Pennsylvania Avenue, waiting as though they still didn't believe the terrible news. This is Richard Valeriani, NBC News, at the White House in Washington.
And now I think it's a matter of major interest, the reaction in Moscow. It is curious that early Saturday morning, Long after dispatches were available in Moscow about H. Lee Oswald, the American communist-oriented young citizen, long after those dispatches reached Moscow, early Saturday morning, a Moscow radio commentator has again connected the shooting of the President of the United States with, quote, extreme rightists in this country. He said at the time he was shot, President Kennedy was carrying the text of a speech which would have condemned the ultra-right-wing groups. And it is quite true, and TASS reporters were well justified, that the President's speech that he would have given later today, we've read parts of it to you, did carry in it certain context to indicate that he was going to at least appeal to right-wing elements of this country to stop their course of action, which appeared to him to be reckless. But the curious part about these dispatches from Moscow early Saturday morning is that they persist in calling this assassination, or labeling it, an assassination by extreme rightists in the United States. They appear not to wish to get out of their minds that the rightists, so far as anybody knows at this time, had nothing to do with it. As a matter of fact, their greatest enemies in the United States had something to do with it, if anybody did, beyond Mr. Oswald, the Texan. About 100 Russian students gathered in front of the American embassy shortly after midnight tonight in Moscow as word of the assassination spread. And one of these students told a passing American that Kennedy was another Lincoln. They wished very definitely, whether on orders or whether by their own wish, they wished very definitely to make it plain that they were friendly toward the United States and toward the President of the United States at this moment. Now, about that speech that the President would have delivered in Dallas. The beginning of the speech we've already read to you twice. It was an appeal to all Americans to unite, and a suggestion, a very strong suggestion, that the greatest thing we could do would be to unite together into the space age and to remain strong. But he was going to make, as we now learn from reporters who were assigned to cover the Texas meetings of the President, we now learn the President tonight meant to attack, in his Dallas speech, to attack his right-wing critics. He intended to tell them that they were talking what he called just plain nonsense. This is the intention of the President of the United States before he was killed today. The theme of his speech that he's prepared or was prepared to deliver at the Dallas Trade Mart. He was on his way to the Trade Mart, and 2,500 diners were waiting him there when he was felled by an assassin's bullet just after noon. The undelivered speech hit very hard at some of the Kennedy opponents. President Kennedy was to have said in the speech that some Americans confuse rhetoric with reality and the plausible with the possible. He was to have said these Americans offer seemingly swift and simple solutions to every world problem, that there are no such solutions in his view. But the President meant to offer no apologies for his own policies to conservatives who oppose him. He declared that the country, or he would have declared in this speech, that the country is stronger than ever before at this time and has the military and the scientific and economic muscle to do whatever must be done for the preservation and promotion of freedom and free countries. Now, at the place where the President was to have spoken, as we noted, 2,500 diners were waiting. And, of course, they had to be informed of the tragic accident on the road, the assassination of the President. The Reverend Luther Holcomb was chosen to step to the microphone and inform the 2,500 Texans that the President would never be able to address them. He did so in halting terms, and then he raised his face and he looked toward heaven and said, "Oh God, we are relying upon the faith that we possess to see us through this most difficult period." There were audible sobs all over the room at the Mart. And there were whispers as soon as the moment of shock and grief or unbelief had passed. Then the crowds bowed heads in silence. A week ago yesterday, on Thursday, on November the 14th to be exact, President Kennedy held his last news conference. If I recollect correctly, this was a conference that was held in the morning in response to requests by afternoon papers. You know, even some of the conservative newspapers that criticized the president for managing the news were among those who asked that they be given a shot at a presidential news conference. In other words, they didn't confuse their political beliefs with the power of a presidential headline, whether it be President Kennedy or President Eisenhower or who. And so the president held a morning news conference. I believe it was this one. And it occurred to us that at this time you would like to hear the President of the United States on his last meeting with the reporters, his last direct and informal contact with the people of this country through the newsmen who cover Washington on radio, television, and for the press. It so happened that on that day, NBC's Robert Goralski introduced the late president at his last news conference.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Morning, gentlemen. Ladies. Come in. Yes.
How menacing do you regard the Cambodian threat to reject our foreign aid? Can that country be slipping into the communist orbit?
Well, I regard it as serious. It's my hope that Prince Sihanouk, who must be concerned about the independence and the sovereignty of his country, he has, after all, been involved for many years in maintaining that independence, will not decide at this dangerous point in the world's affairs to surrender it. I would think that he's more concerned about Cambodian independence than we are. After all, he's a Cambodian, so that my judgment is that in the long run that he will protect that independence. It would be folly not to, and I don't think he's a foolish man.
Mr. President, how do you regard the case involving Professor Barkhorn, and what are we doing about getting his release from the Russian government?
You know, the American ambassador, the United States Embassy, has made 6 protests to the Soviet government in the last 48 hours. Ambassador Kohler has been to the Soviet Foreign Ministry personally. The United States government is deeply concerned about the unwarranted and unjustified arrest of Professor Barkhorn by the fact that he was held for a number of days without the United States being informed of it, and that the United States officials in the Soviet Union have not had an opportunity to visit with him. He was not on an intelligence mission of any kind. He's a distinguished professor of Soviet affairs. He's played a most helpful and constructive role in arranging cultural exchanges, scientific exchanges. We're concerned not only for his personal safety, but because this incident, I think, can have a most serious effect upon what we understood the Soviet government's strong hope, and was certainly our hope, we would find a widening of cultural, intellectual exchanges. We've heard from a good many universities and private organizations which have expressed their alarm, who've been taking part in these exchanges, and it's quite clear that the professor's early release is essential if these programs are to be continued. I can assure you that the Department of State, our embassy in Moscow, will do everything it can to effect the early release of the professor. His arrest is unjustified. I repeat again, he was not on an intelligence mission of any kind. I'm hopeful that this will become quickly obvious to the Soviet Union and that they will release him.
President.
Yes, Mr.
President. Some persons view Professor Barkhorn's arrest as a sign the Soviets are now deliberately seizing innocent Americans with the aim of later swapping them for some of their convicted espionage agents, or that the Soviets may be doing this with the hope of somehow extracting political concessions from us. How would you view any such tactics?
Well, I wouldn't think obviously they would not be successful. I wouldn't attempt to make a judgment as to the conduct of the Soviet Union or what may motivate it from week to week, day to day. But I'm certainly, it's quite obvious that if it's based on the presumptions you state, that it will not be successful.
Mr. President?
Yes?
What are the prerequisites or conditions for resumption of some form of trade with Red China?
We're not planning to trade with Red China in view of the policy that Red China pursues. When if the Red Chinese indicate a desire to live at peace with the United States, with other countries surrounding it, then quite obviously the United States would reappraise its policies. We don't wedded to a policy of hostility to Red China. It seems to me Red China's policies are what create the tension between not only the United States and Red China, but between Red China and India, between Red China and our immediate neighbors to the south, and even between Red China and other communist countries. Yes.
The President now seems unlikely that you will get either your tax bill or your civil rights bill in this session of Congress. Does that disturb you?
Oh, I think that the longer they're delayed, I think that, yes, I think it is unfortunate. The fact of the matter is that both these bills should be passed. The tax bill's been before the Congress for nearly a year. Civil rights has been there for a much shorter time. It didn't go up till June. And I'm hopeful that the House will certainly act on that in the next month, maybe sooner. The tax bill, the hearings have been quite voluminous. It seemed to me that it might be possible to end those hearings and bring the matter to the floor of the Senate before the end of the year. Otherwise, the civil rights bill will come over after the first of the year. There may be a very long debate. The tax bill may be caught up in that. I suppose some people are hopeful that that's so, but I'm not. And I think that the economy will suffer. The economy will suffer, and I think that I certainly would not want to be responsible for that. Therefore, we'd like to get the tax bill out of the way quickly and this important piece of legislation. I would think the members of Congress would.
Mr. President, there have been published reports that General Harkins may have lost his usefulness in Vietnam because of his identification with the Diem regime and lack of contacts with the new generals running the country. Would you care to comment on that?
I think it's wholly untrue. I have complete confidence in him. He was just doing his job. I think he said in the interview yesterday he had seen Mr. New, I think, only 3 times. He'd seen President Zim on a number of occasions. That was his job. That was what he was sent for, to work with the government in power. That's what he will do with the new government. I have great confidence in General Harkins. And there may be some who would like to see General Harkins go, but I plan to keep him there.
Mr. President.
Yes.
Following up that, sir, would you give us your appraisal of the situation in South Vietnam now since the coup and the purposes for the Honolulu conference?
Well, because we do have a new situation and a new government. We hope a increased effort in the war. The purpose of the meeting in Honolulu, which Ambassador Lodge will be there, General Harkins will be there, others, with Secretary McNamara and others, and then, as you know, later Ambassador Lodge will come here, is to attempt to assess the situation, what American policy should be, what our aid policy should be, how we can intensify the struggle, how we can bring Americans out of there. Now, that is our object, to bring Americans home, to permit the South Vietnamese to maintain themselves as a free and independent country, and permit the democratic forces within the country to operate, which they can, of course, much more freely when the assault from the inside, and which is manipulated from the north, is ended. So the purpose of the meeting in Honolulu is how to pursue these objectives. Yeah.
Mr. President, Madam New has now left the United States, but indicated that she intends to return. Will we renew her tourist visa?
Yes.
And if she asks for it, will we grant her permanent residence, perhaps as a political
I think we
resident?
waited, but it would certainly permit her to return to the United States if she wishes to do so. Yeah.
Year by year, the foreign aid program seems to encounter more and more resistance in the Congress, and this year we're seeing senators who ordinarily in the past have gone along with the program.
Yes, this is the worst attack on foreign aid that we've seen since the beginning of the Marshall Plan.
In the event that one of these years the Congress, the arguments for foreign aid notwithstanding, surprises itself by voting the program out, what would we then do?
I think it would be a great mistake. I think, of course, some of the difficulty is where the President sits and where the members of the Senate sit. It's been said very many times, and I've never questioned it, that the Senate and the Congress have every right to decide how much money should be appropriated. That's their constitutional right. But on the other hand, the President bears particular responsibilities in the field of foreign policy. If there are failures in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, South Vietnam, Laos, it's usually not a senator who is selected to bear the blame, but it's the administration, the President of the United States. I regard this, President Eisenhower regarded, and President Truman. It's no coincidence that all three presidents, since this program began, and presidential candidates, Mr. Nixon, Mr. Stevenson, Governor Dewey, that all of them, Governor Rockefeller today, others, seems to me all recognize the importance of this program. It's because it's a very valuable arm of the United States in the field of foreign policy. I don't think it's recognized what an important influence this has. Now, we spend $51 or $2 billion on defense. We spend $2.5 billion on the atomic energy program. We spend $5 billion on space, of which at least a good percentage has a military implication in the sense of our national security. We spend all this money, and yet we're going to deny the President of the United States a very valuable weapon in maintaining the influence of the United States in this very diversified world. I can't imagine anything more dangerous than to end this program. I can assure you that whoever is President of the United States succeeding me will support this program. Now, the second point I want to make is that what we are now talking about is only a fourth of what we tried to do in the early 50s. When I said in the, I don't understand why we are suddenly so fatigued. I don't regard the struggle as over, and I don't think it's probably going to be over for this century. I think this is a continuing effort, and it's not a very heavy one. It's a fraction of our budget, a fraction of our gross national product. The gross national product of the United States has increased $100 billion. We'll have by the end of this year in a 3-year period. So what we're asking is $1 billion less than in the average program since '47. The need today is greater. These countries are poorer. There's a good many more of them. And yet we're being denied. The President of the United States is being threatened with denying him a very important weapon and helping him meet his responsibility. The Congress has its responsibilities, but in the field of foreign policies, there are particular burdens placed on the President, whoever he may be. The Supreme Court in the Curtis Wright has said that the President is the organ of the country in the field of foreign policy. I just want to say, personally as President, and my predecessor said the same, this program is essential to the conduct of our foreign policy. And therefore, I'm asking the Congress of the United States to give me the means of conducting the foreign policy of the United States. And if they do not want to do so, then they should recognize that they're severely limiting my ability to protect the interests of the country. That's how important I think this program is.
President, before you leave the subject, sir, would you comment just a bit further? It is still a fact that a negative action by Congress is something that an administration has great difficulty in coping with. Has the administration, has the government looked ahead to that possibility and prepared against it?
No, I can't believe that the Congress of the United States is going to be so unwise unless we're going to retreat from the world. We're going to give up in South Vietnam. We're going to give up in Latin America. I've said before that what we're talking about in the case of Latin America, the Alliance for Progress, for all of Latin America is what the Soviet Union and the bloc are putting into Cuba alone. Now, can you tell me the United States isn't able to do that? In addition, these amendments, which are passed because they don't like a particular leader or a particular national policy, as of the moment, it's a very changing world. Because they don't like the fishing policy, we're going to decide that end all aid to 2 or 3 countries in Latin America that are hard-pressed, rather than permitting us to negotiate the matter out. But anyway, as I say, they have their responsibilities and I have mine. I just tried to make it very clear that I cannot fulfill my responsibility in the field of foreign policy without this program. Now, the most important program, of course, is our national security, but I don't want the United States to have to put troops there. What's going to happen in Laos if it collapses? They're going to blame the Senate or they're going to blame me? I know who they're going to blame, so I need this program. Yeah.
As a possible candidate for president, would you comment on the possible candidacy of Margaret Chase Smith and specifically what effect that would have on the New Hampshire primary?
I would think, if I were a Republican candidate, I would not look forward to campaigning against Margaret Chase Smith in New Hampshire. Or as a possible candidate for president, I think she's very formidable, if that's the appropriate word to use about a very fine lady. She's a very formidable political figure.
Getting back to Professor Barghorn for a moment,
The negotiations for a renewal of the exchange agreement with the Soviet Union was scheduled to begin next Tuesday, and now, as I understand it, have been postponed.
Right.
Do those negotiations depend upon the release of Professor Barghorn?
I don't think it's helpful for the professor to try to put these conditions upon it. I just say that there's no sense having a program if a man who is innocent of any intelligence mission, which is true in this case, is subjected to arrest without means of defense. How can you carry on that kind of a program? I'm sure that everybody would agree that it would be hopeless under these conditions.
Mr. President,
Yes, there we go. Yes.
Mr. President, would you comment on the weak deal with the Soviet Union and tell us whether the Export-Import Bank or whether any other agency of government is doing more in this deal than it would for any friendly country?
No, it will not do more than it would for any friendly country. The matter is now in private negotiation, and I don't know what's going to happen on the deal. Yes, Mr. Smith.
Would you expand, sir, on the changes in the travel restrictions for Soviet diplomats? For example, in Oregon, there were 5 counties that were off limits during the past 2 years, and now it's been expanded to 13 counties. Could you expand?
Well, in the case of the Soviet Union, 26% of their country are off limits to the United States, and we have put the same percentage of ours. If they would be willing to change that percentage and drop it, I think we would be willing to. Now, in the case of the bloc, we've attempted to put some limitations upon the travel of bloc military attachés because we feel that it's important to the security of the United States and to the alliance. The base of the alliance rests upon the nuclear forces of the United States. I think we have to protect their security. And the Defense Department felt very strongly that this was important to the security of the United States, or otherwise it would not have been done. Yes, Mr. Knight.
I think a few minutes ago you said it would be unfortunate if the tax bill and the civil rights bill don't get through. You just said also it's the worst attack on the foreign aid bill since its inception. Several appropriations bills are still hung up in Congress, the first time in history this late. What's happened on Capitol?
Well, they're all interrelated. I think that there's some delay because of civil rights. That's had an effect upon the passage of appropriation bills. There isn't any question. On the other hand, of course, what we're talking about in both the civil rights bill and the tax bill are very complicated and important pieces of legislation. In fact, more significant in their own way than legislation which has been sent up there for a decade. My judgment is that by the time this Congress goes home, in the sense of next summer, that in the fields of education, mental health, taxes, civil rights, this is going to be a record that's going to be, however dark looks now, I think that westward look the land is bright, and I think by next summer it may be. Yes. Mr. Van Okel, we don't hear very much.
President,
yes.
In view of what you just said, sir, you listed certain items. You didn't mention medical care for the aged.
Yes.
Now, even though Chairman Mills has promised to hold hearings this month, there doesn't seem to be any immediate prospect of clearing it. Since he was so helpful on the tax bill, are you prepared to ask him to cast his vote to get that out of committee so the House can vote on it?
I think that we're going to get that bill out of committee, but not this year, but next year, and I think we'll have a vote on it, and I think it will pass. But I don't think it will pass this year. I think it will next year. I think that's one of the... I didn't mean to make an exclusive list. I'm looking forward to the record of this Congress, but it may not come till... this is going to be an 18-month delivery.
Mr. President, the program put forward by this distinguished committee of private citizens, it seems to go farther than your bill on Medicare. Would you be prepared to sponsor a program, say, if Senator Javits joined with Senator Anderson in a bipartisan measure?
Yes, I'm going to meet with them, and I think that that bill recognized the principle of Social Security. I thought it was a very valuable job because it was a bipartisan. The committee was distinguished Republicans on it as well as Democrats. I'm meeting with Senator Anderson, Senator Javits, and I think that this offers us a good deal of hope for that bill. I think they've given it new life. Mr. Kenworthy?
Part of the disenchantment on Capitol Hill over foreign aid seems to stem from the feeling that the administration hasn't fully used the flexibility it asks. For example,
on aid to Indonesia when President Sukarno is studying Malaysia, or on...
Well, now, Mr. Kenworthy, we've suspended the aid to Indonesia.
But haven't suspended, have you, Mr. President, to United Arab Republic, which is defying the UN and...
Well, in the case of Indonesia, though, we are suspending it. It seems to me it's much better. I don't know what the situation is going to be 3 months from now in regard to relations between Indonesia and Malaysia. I hope they are better. What is the possible use of passing a prohibition against assistance to Indonesia because of its attitude towards Malaysia, when 3 months from now it may or may not be the same as it is today? That's the point. Now, in the United Arab Republic, the United States, as you know, 80% of its assistance consists of food, surplus food. We have been working to try to get an orderly withdrawal in the case of the Yemen. There has not been a conflict, I think a good deal as a result of effort which we and others have made, between Saudi Arabia and the UAR. I am concerned about the Yemen because the rate of the withdrawal, of course, has been quite limited. There are going to be further withdrawals by January, but unless those withdrawals are consistent with earlier statements, I would think that the chance of increased tension between the UAR and Saudi Arabia would substantially increase. But I don't think, Mr. Kenworthy, that the language that the Senate adopted, which calls upon me to make a finding which is extremely complicated to make, is particularly strengthens our hands or our flexibility in dealing with the UAR. In fact, it will have the opposite result. These countries are poor. I'm not now talking about the UAR, most of them. These threats from the United States are going to cut off all aid. There's a great temptation if I were in the country to say, cut it off. I mean, they're nationalists, they're proud, they're in many cases radical. I don't think threats from Capitol Hill bring the result which are frequently hoped. Quiet work may not bring it, but I think there's a great temptation to say that at the time when the Aswan Dam was cut off, that didn't bring the Arab Republic to follow us, produced the opposite result. I'm afraid these other threats, I think it's a very dangerous, untidy world, but we're going to have to live with it. And I think one of the ways to live with it is permit us to function. And if we don't function, the voters will throw us out, but not to make it impossible for us to function by legislative restraints or inadequate appropriations.
Mr. President, in view of congressional sentiment toward the Alliance for Progress program, is your administration going to make any special effort to persuade the government of Argentina not to nationalize American-owned oil companies?
Well, as you know, Governor Harriman visited the Argentine, discussed the matter. It's now in negotiation. What we're concerned about is, if action is taken, that there be adequate machinery for compensation, fair compensation. We can't deny the sovereign right of a country to take action within its borders, but we can insist that there be equitable standards for compensating those whose property is taken away from them. We are attempting to work this out with the Argentine. But the Argentine is faced, as are all of Latin America, with staggering problems. They've emerged from a military hunter, Peronism, and all the rest, democratic election, and this was one of the commitments that were made. So now we attempt to adjust our interests. But we are concerned about the oil, in Argentina and in Peru. Yes, excuse me, Mr.
You were quoted saying you were very satisfied with the vote in Philadelphia. Why were you satisfied?
Because Mayor Tate was elected. As John Bailey said, the Republicans had the statistics and we the opposites, so that's why I was satisfied. Yeah.
The Fred Korth and Bobby Baker cases have prompted some serious questions about the moral and ethical climate in Washington. What is your assessment of today's climate in Washington?
Well, I think it's always... First place, I don't lump the two cases together. I think there are the differences between the two cases. I want to make that clear. So there are differences between the cases. Now, if you're talking about... they're always bound to be in the government, newspaper business, labor, and so on, farmers. There are always going to be people who can't stand the pressure of opportunity, so that what the important point is, what action is taken against them. And I think that this administration has been very vigorous in its action, and I think that we tried to set responsible standards. There's always going to be people that fail to meet that standard, and then we attempt to take appropriate action dealing with each case. But Mr. Baker is now being investigated, and I think we know a good deal more about Mr. Baker before we're through. Other people may be investigated as time goes on. We just try to do the best we can, and I think that the governmental standards, let me say, on the whole, I think compare favorably with those in Washington, with those some other parts of America.
Last week, Mr. President, the Soviet Union in Moscow showed what they claimed was an anti-missile missile. I wonder if you could tell us what you know about that missile. Is it what they claim it is supposed to be? And also, what is the effectiveness of their anti-missile system?
Well, I don't think it's probably useful to discuss it in detail here. I don't think there's any doubt that they have an anti-missile missile, as do we. The problem, of course, however, is what you do with saturation. And I don't think that the Soviet Union or the United States have solved the problem of dealing, as I've said before, with a whole arsenal of missiles coming at us at maximum speed with decoys. That's the impossible. That, up till now, has been the impossible task.
Mr. President, we seem to be in somewhat of a stalemate on recognizing the new regimes in two Latin American countries, the Dominican Republic and Honduras. I'm wondering, the administration perhaps has been reluctant to tell these countries precisely what they had to do to get recognition.
No, we've had discussions with both countries. As you know, this is not just a matter of the United States. This is a matter of nearly the whole hemisphere. In fact, by a vote of 18-1, the OAS voted to have a meeting on the problem of military coups. We've attempted to indicate or inquire what steps each of these two countries, the governments of the two countries, are prepared to take to return to constitutional government, which we regard as the most desirable form of government and also the one that would be most effective in meeting the challenges of the hemisphere. So we've inquired of both of them what steps they're prepared to take, when elections would be, who would be in the government. So we've been working very assiduously.
In general terms, sir, could you say whether we would be prepared to accept the same conditions for recognition there that we did in the case of the junta in Peru? Elections within 1 year, for example?
Well, I think it'd be unwise to attempt to negotiate it out here, but we did recognize the junta in Peru on the assurances that they would hold elections. They did hold them, and the result was very fair, so that it shows that it can be done. That's what we'd like to see done in these countries. Yes.
Mr. President, to go back to the Russian-American problem, given the fact that our relations seem to alternate between hot and cold, the Barkhorn case and the Audubon at the moment, what do you say to those Americans who say that in such a situation we should not sell wheat to the Soviet Union, or certainly not without trying to use it as a method of, say, negotiating some better arrangement on the Audubon?
Well, I think the wheat deal is desirable for us, desirable for the Soviet Union. I'm not convinced it may mean $200 million in balance of payments for us, means wheat to the Soviet Union. But in view of the supplies that the Soviet Union have in its own country, in Australia and Canada, I'm not sure that the wheat can carry other loads. I think it pretty much stands on its own. It's of some benefit to us, some benefit to the Soviet Union, but this idea that other things can be hitched onto it. But we are, quite obviously, this kind of trade that depends upon a reasonable atmosphere in both countries. I think that atmosphere has been badly damaged by the Barkhorn arrest. In the case of the Audubon, this is a continuing matter over a good many years. We're going to maintain our rights in Berlin, and we've made that quite clear. I expect that we're going to have difficulties, and the Soviet Union may have difficulties in other matters. But Professor Barkhorn, I regard as a very serious matter.
President,
yes, Mr. Raymond,
do you feel that you have a firm commitment from the Republicans in the House leadership to back and support in the Rules Committee and on the floor every provision in the compromise bill approved by the House?
I wouldn't want to speak for them. I think they ought to speak for themselves. I will say that a substantial part of that bill bears Republican language and imprint. Wouldn't have been passed without their support. It is a bill which is Republican and Democratic. I think it's a bill which is bipartisan. I would hope it would have it can't pass without bipartisan support. I would hope it would be able to maintain it on the floor of the House because if we don't, we're not even going to get it through the House. Yes, Mr. Raymond.
In view of the changed situation in South Vietnam, do you still expect to bring back 1,000 troops before the end of the year, or has that figure been raised or lowered?
No, we're going to bring back several hundred before the end of the year. But I think on the question of the exact number, I thought we'd wait till the meeting of November 20th.
Yes. Mr. President, we seem to be getting some distressing news from Sao Paulo and Brazil in relation to the Alliance for Progress. The Post had some piece this morning saying that this idea has been circulated by which the alliance would be made worldwide with the participation of Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union, and this to help the alliance reach its goals. Can you tell us in principle what you think about it?
No, I've never heard of that, and we're not proposing to engage in a joint effort with the Eastern Europeans. There may be, that's a matter, of course, of sovereign decision, but I don't regard them as interested at all in the alliance, because the alliance, the Charter of Punta del Este, is based upon the development of free democratic societies in Latin America, which is our objective. Their objective is, of course, different. So I don't see how you can join them in the alliance. Yes.
Several months ago, you nominated David Rabinovich to be a federal judge in western Wisconsin. Since that time, the American Bar Association has opposed this nomination, and the majority of lawyers polled by the State Bar Association said that he was unqualified. Do you still support this nomination, or in view of this opposition, are you going to win?
No, I'm for David Rabinowitz all the way. I know him very well. In fact, for a number of years, and the American Bar Association has been very helpful in making the judgment, but I'm sure they would agree that they are not infallible. Mr. Brandeis was very much opposed. There are a good many judges have been opposed, have been rather distinguished, and I'm for David Rabinowitz. Yes.
Sir, do you mean to leave the implication by your remarks on the wheat thing that if the Barghorn case is not satisfactory?
No, I wouldn't attempt to. I want to get Professor Barghorn out of prison, and it seems to me the best way to do it is to confine my remarks to what I've said. I'm merely saying, in fact, I won't even say it anymore.
President, the senators from New England met this morning in the office of Senator Kennedy and agreed to renew their annual appeal for relief on wool and for the lifting of restrictions on residual oil. What can you do and what will you do to help the people in New England on these problems?
As I understand it, in one case there's a desire to limit imports, and the other is to encourage imports. So that we're, I used to take part in those meetings myself. On the other hand, and there is a matter of concern. As a matter of fact, yesterday I met with the head of the coal producers, Coal Association, very concerned about the imports of residual oil. And but it is a fact that the imports of woolens and worsteds have gone up from about 15 to 22 or 3%. So there has been a sharp increase, and it is a matter of concern. In the case of residual, we are attempting to, that's a matter of great interest, as you know, to Venezuela, which is a country that's under communist attack, and therefore we have to consider that obligation as well as our obligations to the domestic coal industry. So we have not forgotten New England.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
And that was the last press conference, the last news conference that John F. Kennedy ever had. It took place last Thursday morning. We'll be back with more until 1 o'clock on NBC shortly.
The NBC radio network will stay on the air with continuous coverage until 1 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will resume broadcasting at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Saturday, tomorrow, with continuous coverage. We pause 10 seconds for station identification.
Wlw-Radio, Cincinnati, joins its listeners in an expression of deep sorrow on the death of our president.
That press conference that the president gave, I think the most poignant thing so far as I was concerned, and I'm Joseph Michaels of NBC News here at Radio Central now, was the remark by one of the reporters referring to him in connection with Margaret Chase Smith, but referring to Mr. Kennedy jovially as a possible candidate. It hit me, probably you. You think of the things that our new president, Lyndon Johnson, has to face, and I think this news conference brings them all out with tremendous impact. I was just noting down a few as they went along. And these are things on which the President of the United States, with the most responsible job of any single individual in government anywhere in the world, has to be intimately concerned and has to have huge knowledge. For instance, there was reference made to the import of woolens and worsteds, their impact or strength of impact on various parts of our country, but also on our lives. Such things as residual oil. What does the importation to New England? The President has to have an answer. The nomination of a federal judge in Wisconsin. Many times in the past there have been presidents who might not even have remembered the individual, but nowadays a president has to. All of these vast problems that the President will have to face. The Central American problem, what we do about Latin America. When there is a change of government by revolution, do we recognize that country or not? Do we continue our aid to it or not? The entire question of foreign aid. Mr. Johnson has this placed firmly in his lap. An anti-missile missile that the Russians may have. What does the President know about it? The reporters will ask. Medicare, when will it be passed, if ever? Will Mr. Johnson continue the strenuous support of it? The tax cut program to which the President, Mr. Kennedy, was so firmly committed. Civil rights, which has been an important issue, and in which Mr. Johnson, although a Texan, has himself participated strongly. The South Vietnamese War, with which we still live. Latin America, the Alliance for Progress, and all the attendant problems growing continually. What do we do about Brazil with its continued inflation, the government turning farther to the left all of the time, and Argentina, which has taken over oil properties that the United States was involved in, all of the complexities of Middle Eastern governments which change continually. Is this government, when it changes, a government which is connected with the communists, pro or against them, pro or against us? Indonesia, another question. What do we do about Indonesia? There is France. The expressions of condolences are wonderful, exciting, and touching, but our feelings about France still are there. And then elsewhere in Europe, Berlin does not go away. Berlin is still with us. Unfortunately, Tom Pettit is in Dallas. On the latest in connection with the police activities there, we go now to Tom Pettit in Dallas.
Dallas Police Chief J.E. Curry says, "I believe we have the right man." He is discussing 24-year-old Lee Oswald, prime suspect in the assassination of President Kennedy. Questioning of Oswald has been suspended briefly while paraffin tests are run to determine if he is linked with the rifle believed to be the murder weapon. Oswald earlier was charged with the murder of police officer J.D. Tippit, who had gone to apprehend Oswald. But he denies killing President Kennedy, says he is being held because he was in Russia. Tom Pettit, NBC News at Dallas Police Headquarters.
Now, looking at items in connection with both the sad affair and with the future. From China, by the way, the other part of the communist world, there was absolutely no reaction of any kind so far this morning. There are no American correspondents, of course, allowed in Red China. The Reuters news agency is there. Their correspondent reports that there was absolutely no attention given. The news came too late for morning papers, but early morning news broadcasts also ignored the story. In answer to questions, the Foreign Ministry said its reaction to the news would be made known when it was available. And when that sort of statement is made in Red China, the Reuters correspondent there is extremely careful not to challenge it too much if he wants to stay. Diplomats spent the morning glued to radio sets listening to shortwave foreign news broadcasts. Mr. Kennedy's death is unlikely to cause much sorrow, says Reuters, among the communist Chinese, or to cause a halt to continuous attacks on the United States policy. Earlier this week, a major Communist Party statement referred to the late president as, quote, the wildest militarist of all times, the wildest plotters of a new world war, and the most ferocious enemy of world peace, which is about as much of an accolade, perhaps, as the president could have hoped to have received. The new president, Mr. Johnson, what about him? We spoke of the vast numbers of problems that he faced, just the ones that came up in one news conference, these questions of world scope involving our country and its tremendous place, its tremendous problems in the world, and our problems at home, with which Mr. Kennedy had been suffering and striving so greatly. Here is something on Mr. Kennedy's own background, and it shows him as a man eminently equipped to assailed this post. Lyndon Johnson is the 8th American vice president to succeed to the White House on the death of a president, the 4th to gain this position by an assassination. He is 55 years old. He is a Texan. He was chosen by the slain President Kennedy for second place on the 1960 Democratic ticket to strengthen it in the South. And he is credited with holding some of the southern states for Kennedy in the paper-thin Democratic victory 3 years ago. Before he became vice president, Mr. Johnson was Democratic leader of the Senate and was regarded as one of the most skillful strategists ever to function in Congress. As vice president, he did little to intrude on the jealously guarded prerogatives of Congress. I think this is one of the important things to remember. We cannot help but discuss what is going to happen on the morrow because this is the situation. Our country must continue to go on. President Kennedy has died, but the United States is here, and his problems remain. And Mr. Kennedy, as a skilled leader in the Senate, as the man who was tremendously respected there and who was followed by various coalitions, despite the fact that the Democratic-Republican split was great, is a man who can be expected to have a substantial influence there. Only to a certain degree, however, since the Senate continues to jealously guard its prerogatives, as Mr. Johnson himself displayed. On several occasions, as a matter of fact, during his vice presidency, the question was asked sometimes of him directly and sometimes in public meetings, why Mr. Johnson, with all of his intimate knowledge of each of the senators of the United States, didn't do something to push this or that piece of legislation which the administration wanted badly to seem to be made into law. And the answer always was that Mr. Johnson knew, because of this very experience to which people referred, that trying to push the Senate, which is so carefully guarding its prerogatives, is a very dangerous thing to do and will probably cause an evil reaction rather than a good one. It remains to be seen whether he will be more successful than Mr. Kennedy was in getting action from this Congress, which has been a Congress most difficult to deal with in many areas so far as the President's most important programs are concerned. He presumably will replace some, perhaps many, of the Cabinet members and other White House advisors with men of his own choice. This is not necessarily a condemnation insofar as Mr. Johnson is concerned of the men who are in the Cabinet, but you must remember that our system of government differs greatly from that of parliamentary countries such as Great Britain. In our country, the cabinet members are responsible directly to the president. Under the Constitution, they really have very little legal existence. The president must assume responsibility for all of the actions of members of his cabinet, and so they must be not merely men that he can respect, but men with whom he is certain he can work. Now, this can devolve to a matter of personalities. It would seem that Mr. McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, would be one of those who will stay, if he cares to, because Mr. Johnson has many times expressed his tremendous respect for Mr. McNamara and has spoken of him as the strongest man in the cabinet. The course that we mentioned of changing members of the cabinet was followed by former President Harry Truman after he succeeded Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the White House on April 12, 1945. Mr. Kennedy was the first president to fall to an assassin's bullet since the creation of the Secret Service to protect presidents after the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. It reminds me of this, too. I spent a good part of this day out on the streets of this city, and you can't get away from the fact that a lot of people were saying, where was the Secret Service? I have followed presidents of the United States on tours through several countries and through this one. I followed Mr. Khrushchev on his tour here and in France and in Indonesia and in India. And after this, and having talked to many people from the Secret Services of countries all over the world, some of them countries in which there is much less freedom than here, we always came to the same conclusion, that if there is a man with sufficient intelligence and determination and skill, no Secret Service of any kind in any country can prevent his death. And that, of course, is what has shocked America today. The death of a president sends shockwaves through government and the nation, even though his successor is a member of the same political party. And it was a shock to Mr. Truman, you'll remember, who took his apprenticeship in Congress, as did Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Johnson. I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me, Mr. Truman said a day after he was sworn in. I've got the most terrible, responsible job a man ever had. Speaking of Mr. Truman, he issued a statement today. We have that statement at this moment, and I'll give it to you in just a moment. It is time that we break, and we shall be returning to you in just a few seconds.
The NBC radio network will stay on the air with continuous coverage until 1 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will resume broadcasting at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Saturday, tomorrow, with continuous coverage. We pause 10 seconds for station identification.
Wlw-Radio, Cincinnati, joins its listeners in an expression of deep sorrow on the death of our president.
We spoke of former President Truman and his reaction at the time of the death of the former President, Mr. Roosevelt. He issued this statement today from Independence, Missouri. I am shocked beyond words at the tragedy that has happened to our country and to President Kennedy's family today. The president's death is a great personal loss to the country and to me. He was an able president, one the people loved and trusted. Mrs. Truman and I send our deepest sympathy to Mrs. Kennedy and the family. Mrs. Truman said her husband will attend the funeral. She said she has not decided whether she will accompany the former president. Getting back to the background and the career of Lyndon Johnson, the new president of the United States, the people in Washington who observed them most closely noted that Mr. Johnson and Mr. Kennedy were not intimate friends, but even though this was so, the late president gave Mr. Johnson many assignments, goodwill missions abroad, and the chairmanships of the Equal Opportunities Commission and the Space Advisory Council at home. He regularly attended Cabinet and National Security Council meetings and Kennedy's weekly conferences with congressional leaders. It has not always been so, and this is extremely important in this administration. Mr. Johnson's background in the Senate, his tremendous involvement in all of the affairs of the Senate as its leader during all of the years he so successfully led it from the Democratic Party point of view, all of this gives him a tremendous amount of knowledge of these things where knowledge is most urgently required. And his trips abroad. He went to Europe and he went to Latin America. Mr. Johnson was very well acquainted with leaders of these people, and I think one of the most important things to remember in connection with this is that, like Mr. Kennedy, he was a professional politician in what should be considered the best sense. A professional politician in the sense that he lived, breathed, and ate politics all of the time, which means not just the affairs of a party or of two parties or of a district, but the affairs of the nation and its problems and its needs. He kept regularly abreast of these things, and this has not always been the case with vice presidents of the United States. Mr. Nixon was well acquainted with affairs of government, and President Eisenhower made sure that this was the case. However, before that time, Mr. Truman himself had far less acquaintance with the problems of the government and the workings and functionings of the government than did either Vice President Nixon or now, in this case, Mr. Johnson, the new President of the United States. The trips abroad were consequential. The chairmanship of the Equal Opportunities Commission means that Mr. Johnson can speak with authority of the problems of civil rights in which he concerned himself. The Space Advisory Council, of which he was chairman, is extremely important because our space program is, again, one of the problems that he must face. Congress has already lowered the boom on part of the funds for the presidential space program, and there is now a strong question as to whether this program will be put into effect in time, as was promised, to get a manned rocket, to the moon and back in this decade. This, again, is a problem of vast scope, one that Mr. Johnson does know. Turning to other problems, we have the other question of Mr. Johnson's health, which should be considered. If you will remember, Mr. Johnson did suffer a heart attack 8 years ago. But today, heart specialists predicted that he would be a vigorously healthy chief executive despite this. They based their estimate upon the vigorous life Mr. Johnson has led since his months-long recuperation in 1955. He has, as the saying goes, been through the political wars, including the 1960 election campaign as President Kennedy's running mate, and has even faced a mob, one specialist be called, in the unanimous opinion of 3 specialists, a man such as Mr. Johnson, who has had a complete recovery of years-long duration, can face up to the most exacting task, including that of being president. They pointed to the example of President Dwight David Eisenhower, who suffered a heart attack during his first term, but went on to win re-election and still, as we all know, is vigorously and happily healthy. The question of the last rites is one which involves all of America, too. And here are the figures and here are the facts in that area. The last rites for President John F. Kennedy will be performed in Washington Monday at a pontifical requiem mass, which will be celebrated by Richard Cardinal Cushing, Archbishop of Boston. This was announced by the White House tonight in a statement which also said that former Presidents Eisenhower and Truman would arrive in Washington this weekend to join mourning dignitaries. The slain president's body will lie in repose in the East Room of the White House from 10 in the morning until 6 in the evening tomorrow, it was announced. Only the immediate Kennedy family will be present for the first hour, that is, between 10 and 11. No one from the public or from the dignitaries present will be allowed in at that time. President Johnson will head a high-ranking group which will view the body in repose between 11 and 2. Former President Eisenhower will be present at that time, according to the White House announcement, as will Speaker of the House John McCormack and Chief Justice Earl Warren. The body of President Kennedy will lie in state in the rotunda of the Capitol on Sunday and Monday, according to the White House. Mr. Truman plans to arrive in Washington on Sunday. Former President Herbert Hoover has expressed his regret that he will be unable to attend. It was announced by the White House. The former Republican president had a serious operation last year and has been ailing. He is a man of great age. Kennedy's body, the president's body, will be moved in an official cortege from the White House to the rotunda of the Capitol at 1 p.m. Sunday. It will lie in state there until Monday at 11 a.m., and at that time, of course, all of his fellow Americans who wish to see him will be able to do so. His body will be moved at that time to St. Matthew's Cathedral in downtown Washington for a pontifical requiem mass at noon. This will be celebrated by Cardinal Cushing. The public will be permitted to file past the bier in the rotunda shortly after its arrival and until 9 p.m. on Sunday, the announcement said, and then again from 9 to 10 a.m. on Monday. I think I should repeat that. The public will be permitted to file past the bier in the rotunda shortly after its arrival and until 9 p.m. on Sunday, and from 9 to 10 a.m. on Monday. We are just informed that Ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, has arrived in Washington, and we have more for you on that now.
Well, the obsequies and the ceremonies will take place tomorrow. And I said this afternoon in New York that I thought that the tragedy of this day is beyond any instant comprehension. And all of us who knew him will bear the grief of his death until the day of ours. And all men everywhere who love justice and freedom and peace will bow their heads. At such a moment, one can only turn to prayer. Prayer to comfort our grief, to sustain Mrs. Kennedy and his family, and to strengthen President Johnson, and to guide us in time to come. May God help us all.
And the voice you undoubtedly recognize as that of Adlai Stevenson. One wonders if memories, rather recent memories, came to Mr. Stevenson when he heard this hideous news of the time when he was in Dallas just a short time ago, when right-wing pickets who dislike his foreign policy and the administration's foreign policies generally picketed him, and he actually got hit with a sign by one of them, an incident which he dismissed, but which perhaps he recalled now because of the president's death in Dallas. I think we've been talking about the career of Mr. Johnson for just a moment. and I think perhaps it might be appropriate for us to review some of the highlights in the career of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. His birth came on the 29th of May in 1917. He was born in Brookline, Massachusetts, the second of 9 children to former Ambassador to Great Britain, Joseph P. Kennedy, and his wife, Rosalie. His body will be placed in the family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts. He graduated from Harvard cum laude in 1940 with a degree of Bachelor of Science. And in 1942, he wrote a book which was a best-selling book in the area of nonfiction. It was about the World War, and the book was Why England Slept. Between 1941 and 1945, he was, as I guess all of the world knows by now, thanks to a motion picture and thanks to all of the talk by all of the people who admired him, an officer in the United States Navy. He rose to the rank of lieutenant in command of a PT boat. In 1943, he was badly injured when his boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer off the Solomon Islands, which, again, as I assume almost everyone must know, he displayed tremendous heroism. Between 1947 and 1953, he served as a United States Congressman from Massachusetts. And this was the period during which one writer who specialized in the area of the South Seas tells of being in one such place. The name of the place doesn't come back to me at the moment. But a young man came through, he said, unattended by aides and unattended by official parties, wearing a wash-and-wear shirt, his armpits sweaty, a young man in a hurry. He came in and he said he wanted to know things. His name was John F. Kennedy. He didn't want to meet presidents and he didn't want to meet celebrities. He wanted to learn, and he wanted to learn in a hurry. He was asked to whom did he want to speak. He said he wanted to speak to the newsmen. That was how he could learn. And this was the way he spent his life, learning as much as he possibly could and spending all of his time trying to do so. In 1952, John F. Kennedy was elected to the Senate of the United States, defeating for the first time Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, 2 attractive young men from every possible point of view, both physical as well as intellectual, who met head-on. And Boston and its environs pushed Mr. Kennedy into the Senate. He liked the political fight, and he displayed it even at that time. In 1953, Senator Kennedy was married to Jacqueline Bouvier in Newport, Rhode Island. In 1954 and 1955, he was struck down by sickness, as has happened more than once to great men in the history of this country, and spent 6 months in the hospital undergoing and convalescing from major surgery on back injury, which was aggravated by the sinking of his PT boat. There were those who mourned for him even then as one whose life was just about gone, but the then Senator Kennedy refused to give in to this and fought back fiercely and successfully, even as he had during the war in which he had been a hero. In 1956, Senator Kennedy won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, Profiled in Courage, one of the most quoted books of our time. In 1956, he narrowly missed winning the Democratic vice presidential nomination in Chicago, losing in a close contest to the late Senator Estes Kefauver, who was a Democrat from Tennessee, who also just recently died of a heart attack. I remember that contest very well. I was one of the correspondents, one of the many, many correspondents in Chicago, and it was an extremely interesting time. Adlai Stevenson was the nominee of the Democratic Party at that time, and he did not obey the usual procedure and protocol. He decided to throw the convention open. It was a peculiar time because you get swept up by conventions. All of us who were there, had we been thinking carefully, would have known that it didn't really make any difference. President Eisenhower had served a tremendously successful first term. He was greatly popular all over the country. The polls already indicated that there was nobody who had any conceivable chance to beat him. But the excitement of a convention is something that is completely unmeasurable by any standards that you can think of. And everybody thinks that anything can happen and that anybody can win. So that therefore, when this convention was thrown open in 1956, there were caucuses and there were meetings called all over the hotels on the Chicago waterfront, because the man who got the nomination was going to be the man who fought hardest for it during the night. And there were meetings called here and there. Somebody said Senator Kennedy is having a meeting, and elsewhere Senator Kefauver was calling a meeting. and the senior senator from Minnesota was having one. All of these people rushing back and forth, correspondents spending the night going from one meeting to another as the candidates tried to drum up strength to show that they had the popularity and the strength to get the nomination. Well, Mr. Kennedy, of course, did not get it. Estes Kefauver did. Perhaps at that time it was a favor to him because he would have been, of course, the vice presidential candidate on a losing ticket. This did not stop another candidate once, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but it could have done so in this case. Nevertheless, he was a loser at that time, but he learned something. And we all discovered at that time that the Kennedy family knew a great deal about politics and had to be looked for in the future. In 1957, returned to the Senate again, he became the father of his first child, Carolyn. In 1958, he won re-election to the Senate by an overwhelming vote. The Kennedy family was already thinking in terms of the presidential nomination, and they ran as hard as ever they could. They organized the campaign to a fare thee well in Massachusetts. There was no question in anyone's mind that Senator Kennedy would be re-elected. But the important thing to the Kennedy hopes was that the re-election should be so strong that it would boost his presidential chances greatly, and this is what actually happened. In 1960, on July 14th, Mr. Kennedy won the Democratic presidential nomination on the first ballot, and all of the country stood back in awe at the political prowess that the Kennedy family and their supporters had showed during the entire campaign, the fight in Wisconsin and the fight in West Virginia and all through, the organization that they had displayed. Well, in 1960, President Kennedy then defeated Vice President Richard Nixon for the presidency in a close-fought ballot that gave him a final edge of scarcely 100,000 ballots. In 1961, he became the father of a son, John Jr., his second child. In 1961, too, in April, he started to have problems with Cuba, and Cuba seems to have haunted President Kennedy's life. He took full responsibility at that time for the ill-fated Cuban invasion, which was staged by dissident exile groups, and there was vast dispute over the extent the United States had promised aid and the extent to which it should have, under any circumstances, given aid. In 1962, in October, he forced Russia to withdraw its missiles, the missiles that it had secreted in Cuba with atomic warheads, and all of the world breathed a sigh of relief. In 1964,
the NBC radio network will stay on the air with continuous coverage until 1 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will resume broadcasting at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Saturday, tomorrow, with continuous coverage. We pause 10 seconds for station identification.
Wlw-Radio is suspending its regularly scheduled programs during this time of mourning for our late President, John F. Kennedy. We ask you to join with us in prayer for John Kennedy, his family, and President Lyndon Johnson.
So, the Dallas Assembly and the Graduate Research Center of the Southwest at the Trade Mart in Dallas. I would like to read you some excerpts from the speech that President Kennedy was to have given. He said, "In a world of complex and continuing problems, in a world full of frustrations and irritations, America's leadership must be guided by the lights of learning and reason, or else those who confuse rhetoric with reality and the plausible with the possible will gain the popular ascendancy with their seemingly swift and simple solutions to every world problem." He spoke of his people, saying there will always be dissident voices heard in the land, expressing opposition without alternatives, finding fault but never favor, perceiving gloom on every side, and seeking influence without responsibility. Those voices are inevitable. But today, other voices are heard in the land, voices preaching doctrines wholly unrelated to reality, wholly unsuited to the 60s, doctrines which apparently assume that words will suffice without weapons, that vituperation is as good as victory, and that peace is a sign of weakness. At a time when the national debt is steadily being reduced in terms of its burden on our economy, they see that debt as the greatest single threat to our security. The president went on and said, "I realize that this nation often tends to identify turning points in world affairs with the major addresses which preceded them. But it was not the Monroe Doctrine that kept all Europe away from this hemisphere. It was the strength of the British fleet and the width of the Atlantic Ocean. It was not General Marshall's speech at Harvard which kept communism out of Western Europe. It was the strength and stability made possible by our military and economic assistance. In this administration also, it has been necessary at times to issue specific warnings that we could not stand by and watch the communists conquer Laos by force, or intervene in the Congo, or swallow West Berlin, or maintain offensive missiles on Cuba. But while our goals were at least temporarily obtained in these and other instances, our successful defense of freedom was due not to the words we used, but to the strength we stood ready to use on behalf of the principles we stand ready to defend. And he spoke of the different kinds of strength. He spoke of nuclear strength and of our strategic bombers. And then he went on to say, but the lessons of the last decade have taught us that freedom cannot be defended by strategic nuclear power alone. We have, therefore, in the last 3 years accelerated the development and deployment of tactical nuclear weapons. Nor can Europe or any other continent rely on nuclear forces alone, President Kennedy would have said, whether they are strategic or tactical. We have radically improved the readiness of our conventional forces, and he went on to describe that readiness and talked about Operation Big Lift, the operation that took so many of our troops, more than a division, to Europe. American military might, he said, should not and need not stand alone against the ambitions of international communism. Our security and strength, in the last analysis, directly depend on the security and strength of others. Our foreign aid program is not growing in size. It is, on the contrary, smaller now than in previous years, Mr. Kennedy would have said. These are some of the points that he would have made in the speech he was scheduled to deliver tonight in Dallas. What about the future? What about congressional attitude? And what about the succession of President Johnson to the presidency of the United States and the position in the White House? We have a report on that now from Robert Abernathy in Washington.
Although Lyndon Johnson has become president, no one under our system of succession automatically moves up now to vice president. John McCormick of Massachusetts, Speaker of the House of Representatives, 72 years old, would now become president should Lyndon Johnson die. But Mr. McCormick does not automatically become vice president, nor does he expect to assume additional duties, for instance, on those occasions when the new president might be away from Washington. President Johnson met Speaker McCormick and the other leaders of the House and Senate this evening. Mr. Johnson was described afterwards by one who was there as humble and chastened. The Republican leader of the Senate, Everett Dirksen, said earlier this evening that he thought Congress would not change its plan to continue work until December 20th. There are appropriations bills, for instance, which must be passed. Other Capitol leaders echo this feeling. I think we should carry on, one said. Congress must show the world continuity. Congressional leaders know Lyndon Johnson well. They remember him as an effective Senate leader, not afraid to make decisions. Tonight they expect Congress to work with him sympathetically, giving him every chance they can to become accustomed to his new burdens. This is Robert Abernathy, NBC News, Washington.
The telegrams of condolences from the countries of the free world and some of the countries of the communist world continue to pour in. From France, a message from the French Premier, Monsieur Georges Pompidou, to President Lyndon Johnson said, deeply moved by the tragic loss experienced by the United States on the death of President Kennedy, whose courage and great gifts as a statesman were admired by all the French people. I wish to convey to you the grief felt by all my fellow countrymen. Rest assured that at a time when under such cruel circumstances you take up your high office, my colleagues of the French government and myself join with you in a feeling of most grieving and most loyal friendship. Everyone, you get the feeling, searches for words to try to find them, to try and find the right ones, to show the strength of our feelings. Everyone all over the world, and it's extremely difficult, but the feelings are all there. A telegram to Mrs. Kennedy from General Douglas MacArthur said, I realize the utter futility of words at such a time, but the world of civilization shares the poignancy of this monumental tragedy. As a former comrade in arms, said General Douglas MacArthur, his death killed something within me. And of course, General MacArthur was the supreme commander, a man of great renown, and during the World War, at the time when the former president was a rather minor lieutenant junior grade in charge of a PT boat. The governor of New Jersey, Governor Hughes, a Democrat, also had a reaction to this tragedy. Let's hear that now.
I share with my countrymen today a shock and grief which defies description. A young and fearless American has died in the service of his country Even as many years ago, his body absorbed the wounds of battle in the name of freedom. Now John Kennedy belongs to history, and his courageous spirit joins the fellowship of those who never flinched in the doing of right and in the search for justice. May God bless him and his family and the America he loves so deeply. To President Johnson, now assuming the burdens of an office on which rest the hopes of all humanity, go the prayers and dedication of every one of us.
And that was Governor Richard Hughes of New Jersey. Another statement, which is, well, certainly interesting, comes from the American Communist Party. The address is given as 23 West 26th Street in New York City. The statement referred to this dastardly crime and said it was the ultimate depravity of the pro-fascist ultra-right forces. I'll give you the quote in more detail. It is the ultimate depravity of the pro-fascist ultra-right forces, of the fiendish Dixiecrats and racists who will stop at nothing to destroy the democratic institutions of the country, to threaten the peace of the world, and to turn back the clock of history. This seems to be the communists following the Soviet line. As you heard earlier from NBC's John Chancellor in West Berlin, the official communist line with which they were stuck, because they made the statements before we actually had any details, was to the effect that there was a rightist organization and rightist individuals who had been responsible for the shooting of President Kennedy. The later information, of course, seems to indicate otherwise, that it was, in fact, an individual whose sympathies lay quite strongly with the communists and their cause. But the American Communist Party is following along the lines laid down by it, for it, by their communist masters elsewhere. A statement from Senator Barry Goldwater, a Republican conservative from Arizona, mentioned, of course, frequently as a possible Republican candidate, and a man who many people think would have been the opponent to President Kennedy in the next year's election, was that it is both shocking and dreadful that a thing like this could happen in a free country. Senator Goldwater learned of the president's death at a Chicago airport. He was flying to Indiana for the funeral of his mother-in-law, Mrs. Ann Davis Johnson. He telephoned a statement to his Washington Senate office. Senator Goldwater said, "The president's death is a profound loss to the nation and the free world. He and I were personal friends. It is also a great loss to me. Mrs. Goldwater and I offer our heartfelt sympathies to Mrs. Kennedy and the president's family." High officials, governors, and senators from all over the country are trying to express their regret, their sincere regret and misery over this terrible thing. And we have now a statement issued by Governor James Davis of the state of Louisiana.
I'm shocked that such a thing as this could happen in this country in this day and age. This is murder in its most vile form. The warped mind that caused this crime apparently felt that political questions were involved. But the basic issue is whether the President of the United States, or for that matter any individual, can be free to express his views without having to sacrifice his life. Differences of opinion can be settled at the ballot boxes. And to depart from this is to depart from morality and democracy alike, and undermines everything this country stands for. I am sorry for the President's family, and I extend to President Johnson my best wishes to him during the difficult and trying times ahead.
And from Governor Cal Rolvag of Minnesota, this statement.
The grief and the great sense of loss all Americans are experiencing at the death of our President. Thousands of Minnesotans have thrilled to his presence in our state and have rallied to the great ideals he represented and fought for on behalf of all Americans. Throughout America and throughout Minnesota tonight, there is a deep sorrow that this most fearless and determined of leaders has not been allowed to see the fruition of his dream, the total emancipation and loosening of the spirit of all human beings everywhere in the world. I'm certain that countless millions extend their anguished sympathy to the President's family and friends. In consolation, we can say that the spirit of President Kennedy will live on. His principles, his devotion to the welfare of all people, cannot be stilled by the warped minds that launched his assassin's bullet. For what his
How's that?
Governor Rolvac of Minnesota. Just in this information, President Kennedy's body will be brought from Bethesda Naval Hospital to the White House sometime during the night. This, according to Acting Presidential Press Secretary Andrew Hatcher. The body will lie there in repose on a platform called a catafalque, similar to the one, in fact, which was used for President Lincoln, who fell to an assassin's bullet in 1865. Mr. Hatcher said the body now is in the care of Gawler's funeral home. Undertakers of this establishment are preparing the body for burial at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, according to Mr. Hatcher. Speaking of the White House, we have some information from there concerning the new president and the problems he faces and the other problems attendant. From NBC's Richard Valieriani, we join him now at the White House.
The White House has just announced that the body of President Kennedy will be brought sometime tonight to the East Room of the White House, where it will lie in repose through tomorrow. There it will be viewed by the new president, Lyndon Johnson, members of the late president's family, and other high-ranking officials of the government and diplomatic representatives in the Capitol. The White House said that the body will rest on a raised platform, a catafalque, similar to the one used for President Abraham Lincoln, who was also assassinated about 100 years ago. An honor guard will be in continuous attendance. The catafalque will be flanked by 2 lighted candles. The coffin containing President Kennedy's remains is now at Bethesda Naval Hospital. That is where the widow, Mrs. Kennedy, is spending the night. She will return to the White House in the morning. These other bits of information became available just a short while ago. The White House said that for the time being, President Johnson will work in the more familiar surroundings of his vice presidential offices in the Executive Office Building across the street from the White House. The 6 cabinet members who were on their way to Japan for economic talks and then turned around when they heard of the president's assassination are now scheduled to arrive shortly after midnight in Washington. They'll view the body in repose tomorrow, and Secretary of State Dean Rusk is scheduled to meet with the new president at 9:30 in the morning. This is Richard Valieriani, NBC News, at the White House in Washington.
Other news in connection with the shooting and in connection with the world and its reception of the news. Texas Governor John Connally, who was wounded today during the assassination of President Kennedy, is now described as being in good condition. A spokesman at the Parkland Hospital in Dallas says the governor still does not know the president is dead. Governor Connally underwent a 4-hour chest operation after he was wounded this afternoon. An aide says he came to and asked for his wife, and then he asked her about their children. Doctors report the governor is, quote, mentally alert and comfortable, although he has not yet asked about Mr. Kennedy. The bullet which wounded him entered his right shoulder and then emerged through his chest. Removed and a cut lung repaired. But again, we repeat this one piece of good news that the governor of Texas, Mr. John Connally, is described by medical spokesman as being in good condition. Telling the world about the news, Radio Liberty opened up all of its 18 transmitters with close to 2 million watts of power today to bring all aspects of President Kennedy's assassination to its large audience, or anticipated large audience, within the Soviet Union. Their programming at Radio Liberty is in Russian and in 16 other languages, and is now being carried on repeatedly, giving a feature profile of the new president, Lyndon Johnson, which assures Soviet citizens that the administration's current policies will continue as before. And this is confirmed by other sources, anticipating from Mr. Johnson's statements in a variety of fields and at a variety of times that he is as one with the former president in the area of foreign policy. Radio Liberty has been broadcasting a special feature to the world and to the Soviet Union on the peaceful transition of authority to the new president in accordance with constitutional procedures. This, of course, presents an obvious contrast to the way there have been successions in the Soviet Union and in other communist countries. The program shows the orderliness of government processes during emergencies such as that of today. All Russians will take this to heart, remembering the death of Stalin and the jockeying for power and the murder and eventually the final survival of one candidate alone, Mr. Khrushchev, after the elimination of all of his rivals. Other special programs now being repeated on all Radio Liberty channels include excerpts from President Kennedy's American University speech in Washington, D.C. last June, which was considered by many as a significant contribution to world understanding. It's generally thought that that speech, the one delivered by President Kennedy at American University, was the speech which eventually led to the partial nuclear test ban treaty. Mr. Johnson grimly assumed the burdens of the presidency tonight, and in an immediate flurry of activity, won a pledge of bipartisan congressional cooperation in the dark days that will follow President Kennedy's assassination. Speaking of congressional reaction, we have a substantial amount of it here, which I'll pass on to you. My God, what are we coming to? These were the only words that Speaker John McCormick could utter when he was told of the death of the president. Senate Democratic leader Mike Mansfield immediately summoned all senators to the floor for a special period of prayer while the president was dying. He called the slaying not only a great tragedy for the nation, but it is, I think, he said, a mark against the respectability and responsibility of some of our citizens. Senate Republican leader Everett Dirksen, on learning of the shooting, could only exclaim, "Oh, God, this is the most distressing thing that could ever happen." After the president died, Senator Dirksen still could barely summon words. He called the crime incredible and told newsmen, "I'm a little bewildered, as I know the nation and the whole world will be." Of the assassin, Dirksen said the gates of hell must have been concealed and congealed inside of him. He mourned President Kennedy as the victim of a violent and indescribable hate. Senator Margaret Chase Smith, Republican of Maine, who has known Mr. Kennedy both in the House and in the Senate, burst into tears when she was told the news while eating lunch. There was anger against the perpetrator of the killing, as well as mourning and eulogy for the dead president. Senator Richard Russell, leader of the Senators' Southern Bloc, called it a dastardly crime. He said the assassination's bullet has stricken a brilliant and dedicated statesman at the very height of his power. And speaking of Georgia and of reaction from that state, we have here a statement from Governor Carl Sanders of the state of Georgia.
I'm sure that I speak for all Georgians as well as Americans and free men everywhere in expressing my deep regret over the untimely passing of our President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Not only has the country been robbed of a dynamic leader, but I also feel a deep personal loss. It had been my pleasure and privilege to know the President as a friend. He was deeply concerned about the welfare of all people everywhere. No one has been a stronger and more dedicated fighter for freedom for all the people. Ms. Sanders and I extend our personal grief and sympathy to Mrs. Kennedy and the President's family. We are confident in our faith that Almighty God in His infinite mercy will give them the strength necessary to withstand the sadness of the passing of husband and father. They, as all Americans, can take renewed hope in the sacrifice that has been made by this great American, whose devotion to his country has been answered to its last full measure.
Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, we are informed, was under her doctor's care tonight at Bethesda Naval Hospital in suburban Maryland, where she accompanied her husband's body. Dr. John Walsh, Mrs. Kennedy's personal physician, was at Andrews Air Force Base in nearby Maryland to be on hand when the presidential jet plane landed, and he remained at the hospital with Mrs. Kennedy tonight. But there is somebody waiting who knows more about these things and of the affairs generally taking place in Washington. So let's call in now NBC's Robert Abernathy in Washington.
Funeral details are being handled by a private Washington undertaker, Joseph Gawler's Sons, Incorporated. At 4:25 this afternoon, this firm was requested to prepare the president's body. Tonight, 4 men from Gawler's went to the Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the president's body was taken from the airport. With them went a mahogany casket and a so-called church truck, a support for the casket. Specific arrangements have at no time been firm. It had been thought that the president's body would be brought to the funeral home en route to the White House. 24 Washington policemen were detailed to the home. So was a 5-man honor guard, 1 enlisted man each from the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. Their job would have been to guard the room in which the president's body might have lain. But now that plan has been changed. The President's body, professionally prepared, is now expected to be taken directly to the White House tonight. At the funeral home, the honor guard waits to be told to go home, and on the lighted board on which are written the names of those for whom the home is arranging funerals.